Section 1 of The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The Green Flag. When Jack Connolly of the Irish Shotgun Brigade, the Rory of the Hills Inner Circle, and the extreme left wing of the Land League, was incontinently shot by Sergeant Murdoch of the Constabulary in a little moonlight frolic near Kanturk, his twin brother Dennis joined the British Army. The countryside had become too hot for him, and as the 75 shillings were wanting which might have carried him to America, he took the only way handy of getting himself out of the way. Seldom has Her Majesty had a less promising recruit, for his hot Celtic blood seethed with hatred against Britain and all things British. The sergeant, however, smiling complacently over his 6 foot of brawn and his 44-inch chest, whisked him off with a dozen other of the boys to the depot at Fermoy, whence in a few weeks they were sent on, with the spadework kinks taken out of their backs, to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Mallows at the top of the roster for foreign service. The Royal Mallows at about that date were as a strange lot of men as ever were paid by a great empire to fight its battles. It was the darkest hour of the land struggle, when the one side came out with crowbar and battering ram by day, and the other with mask and with shotgun by night. Men driven from their homes and potato patches found their way even into the service of the government, to which it seemed to them that they owed their troubles, and now and then they did wild things before they came. There were recruits in the Irish regiments who would forget to answer to their own names, so short had been their acquaintance with them. Of those the Royal Mallows had their full share, and while they still retained their fame as being one of the smartest corps in the army, no one knew better than their officers that they were dry rotted with treason, and with a bitter hatred for the flag of which they served. And the centre of all the disaffection was C Company, in which Dennis Connolly found himself enrolled. They were Celts, Catholics, and men of the tenant class to a man, and their whole experience of the British government had been an inexorable landlord and a constabulary who seemed to them to be always on the side of the rent collector. Dennis was not the only moonlighter in the ranks, nor was he alone in having an intolerable family blood feud to harden his heart. Savagery had begotten savagery in that veiled civil war. A landlord with an iron mortgage weighing down upon him had small bowels for his tenantry. He did but take what the law allowed, and yet with men like Jim Holan, or Patrick Maguire, or Peter Flynn, who had seen the roofs torn from their cottages and their folk huddled among the pitiable furniture on the roadside, it was ill to argue about abstract law. What matter that in that long and bitter struggle there was many another outrage on the part of the tenant, and many another grievance on the side of the landowner? A stricken man can only feel his own wound, and the rank and file of the C Company of the Royal Mallows was sore and savage to the soul. There were low whisperings in barrack rooms and canteens, stealthy meetings in public-house parlours, bandying of passwords from mouth to mouth, and many other signs which made their officers right glad when the order came which sent them to foreign, and better still, to active service. For Irish regiments have before now been disaffected, and have at a distance looked upon the foe as though he might in truth be the friend. But when they have been put face on to him, and when their officers have dashed to the front with a wave and halloo, those rebel hearts have softened, and their gallant Celtic blood has boiled with the mad joy of the fight, until the slower Britons have marvelled that they ever could have doubted the loyalty of their Irish comrades. So it would be again, according to the officers, and so it would not be if Dennis Connolly and a few others could have their way. It was a March morning upon the eastern fringe of the Nubian desert. The sun had not yet risen, but a tinge of pink flushed up as far as the cloudless zenith, and the long strip of sea lay like a rosy ribbon across the horizon. From the coast inland stretched the dreary sand plains, dotted over with thick clumps of mimosa scrub and mottled patches of thorny bush. No tree broke the monotony of that vast desert. The dull, dusty hue of the thickets and the yellow glare of the sand were the only colours, save at one point where, from a distance, it seemed that a landslip of snow-white stones had shot itself across a low foothill. But as the traveller approached he saw with a thrill that these were no stones, but the bleaching bones of a slaughtered army, with its dull tints, its gnarled viperous bushes, its arid barren soil, and this death streak trailed across it. It was indeed a nightmare country. Some 8 to 10 miles inland the rolling plain curved upwards with a steeper slope, until it ran into a line of red basaltic rock which zigzagged from north to south, heaping itself up at one point into a fantastic knoll. On the summit of this there stood upon that March morning 3 Arab chieftains: the Sheikh Kadra of the Haden Doas, Musa Wad Abahegel, who led the Berber dervishes, and Hamid Wad Hussein, who had come northward with his fighting men from the land of the Bagharas. They had all 3 just risen from their praying carpets, and were peering out with fierce, high-nosed faces thrust towards the stretch of country revealed by the spreading dawn. The red rim of the sun was pushing itself now above the distant sea, and the whole coastline stood out brilliantly yellow against the rich deep blue beyond. At one spot lay a huddle of white-walled houses, a mere splotch in the distance, while 4 tiny cock-boats which lay beyond marked the position of 3 of Her Majesty's 10,000-ton troopers and the Admiral's flagship. But it was not upon the distant town, nor upon the great vessels, nor yet upon the sinister white litter which gleamed in the plain beneath them, that the Arab chieftains gazed. 2 miles from where they stood, amid the sandhills and the mimosa scrub, a great parallelogram had been marked by piled-up bushes. From the inside of this dozens of tiny blue smoke reeks curled up into the morning air, while there rose from it a confused deep murmur. The voices of men and the gruntings of camels blended into the same insect buzz. "The unbelievers have cooked their morning food," said the Baggara chief, shading his eyes with his tawny, sinewy hand. "Truly their sleep has been scanty, for Hamid and 100 of his men have fired upon them since the rising of the moon." "So it was with these others," answered the Sheikh Kadra, pointing with his sheathed sword towards the old battlefield. "They also had a day of little water and a night of little rest, and the heart was gone out of them ere the sons of the Prophet had looked them in the eyes. This blade drank deep that day, and will again before the sun has travelled from the sea to the hill." "And yet these are other men," remarked the Berber dervish. "Well I know that Allah has placed them in the clutch of our fingers, yet it may be that they with the big hats will stand firmer than the cursed men of Egypt." "Pray Allah that it may be so," cried the fierce Baggara, with a flash in his black eyes. "It was not to chase women that I brought 700 men from the river to the coast. See, my brother, already they are forming their array." A fanfare of bugle calls burst from the distant camp. At the same time the bank of bushes at one side had been thrown or trampled down, and the little army within began to move slowly out onto the plain. Once clear of the camp they halted, and the slant rays of the sun struck flashes from bayonet and from gun barrel as the ranks closed up, until the big pith helmets joined into a single long white ribbon. 2 streaks of scarlet glowed on either side of the square, but elsewhere the fringe of fighting men was of the dull yellow khaki tint which hardly shows against the desert sand. Inside their array was a dense mass of camels and mules bearing stores and ambulance needs. Outside, a twinkling clump of cavalry was drawn up on each flank, and in front a thin scattered line of mounted infantry was already slowly advancing over the bush-strewn plain, halting on every eminence and peering warily around as men might who have to pick their steps among the bones of those who have preceded them. The 3 chieftains still lingered upon the knoll, looking down with hungry eyes and compressed lips at the dark steel-tipped patch. "They are slower to start than the men of Egypt," the Sheikh of the Hadendowas growled in his beard. "Slower also to go back, perchance, my brother," murmured the dervish. "And yet they are not many, 3,000 at the most, and we are 10,000 with the Prophet's grip on our spear shafts and his words upon our banner. See to their chieftain how he rides upon the right and looks up at us with a glass that sees from afar. It may be that he sees this also." The Arab shook his sword at the small clump of horsemen who had spurred out from the square. "Lo, he beckons!" cried the dervish. "And see those others at the corner, how they bend and heave. Ah, by the Prophet, I had thought it." As he spoke, a little woolly puff of smoke spurted up at the corner of the square, and a 7-pound shell burst with a hard metallic smack just over their heads. The splinters knocked chips from the red rocks around them. "Bismillah!" cried the Hadendoa. "If the gun can carry thus far, then ours can answer to it. Ride to the left, Musa, and tell Ben Ali to cut the skin from the Egyptians if they cannot hit yonder mark. And you, Hamid, to the right, and see that 3,000 men lie close in the wady that we have chosen. Let the others beat the drum and show the banner of the Prophet, for by the black stone their spears will have drunk deep ere they look upon the stars again." A long, straggling, boulder-strewn plateau lay on the summit of the red hills, sloping very precipitously to the plain, save at one point where a winding gully curved downwards, its mouth choked with sand mounds and olive-hued scrub. Along the edge of this position lay the Arab host, a motley crew of shock-headed desert clansmen, fierce predatory slave dealers of the interior, and wild dervishes from the Upper Nile, all blent together by their common fearlessness and fanaticism. Two races were there as wide as poles apart, the thin-lipped, straight-haired Arab and the thick-lipped, curly Negro, yet the faith of Islam had bound them closer than a blood tie. Squatting amongst the rocks or lying thickly in the shadow, they peered out at the slow-moving square beneath them, while women with water-skins and bags of doura fluttered from group to group, calling out to each other those fighting texts from the Koran which in the hour of battle are maddening as wine to the true believer. A score of banners waved over the ragged, valiant crew, and among them, upon desert horses and white bishareen camels, were the emirs and sheiks who were to lead them against the infidels. As the Sheikh Kadra sprang into his saddle and drew his sword, there was a wild whoop and a clatter of waving spears, while the one-ended war drums burst into a dull crash like a wave upon shingle. For a moment 10,000 men were up on the rocks with brandished arms and leaping figures. The next they were under cover again, waiting sternly and silently for their chieftain's orders. The square was less than half a mile from the ridge now, and shell after shell from the 7-pound guns were pitching over it. A deep roar on the right, and then a second one, showed that the Egyptian Krupps were in action. Sheikh Kadra's hawk eyes saw that the shells burst far beyond the mark, and he spurred his horse along to where a knot of mounted chiefs were gathered round the two guns which were served by their captured crews. "How is this, Ben Ali?" he cried. "It was not thus that the dogs fired when it was their own brothers in faith at whom they aimed." A chieftain reined his horse back and thrust a blood-smeared sword into its sheath. Beside him 2 Egyptian artillerymen with their throats cut were sobbing out their lives upon the ground. "Who lays the gun this time?" asked the fierce chief, glaring at the frightened gunners. "Here, thou black-browed child of Shaitan, aim, and aim for thy life." It may have been chance or it may have been skill, but the third and fourth shells burst over the square. Sheikh Kadra smiled grimly and galloped back to the left, where his spearmen were streaming down into the gully. As he joined them, a deep growling rose from the plain beneath, like the snarling of a sullen wild beast, and a little knot of tribesmen fell into a struggling heap, caught in the blast of lead from a gardener. Their comrades passed on over them and sprang down into the ravine. From all along the crest burst the hard, sharp crackle of Remington fire. The square had slowly advanced, rippling over the low sandhills and halting every few minutes to rearrange its formation. Now, having made sure that there was no force of the enemy in the scrub, it changed its direction and began to take a parallel line to the Arab position. It was too steep to assail from the front, and if they moved far enough to the right, the general hoped that he might turn it. On the top of those ruddy hills lay a baronetcy for him and a few extra hundreds in his pension, and he meant having them both that day. The Remington fire was annoying, and so were those 2 Krupp guns. Already there were more cacolets full than he cared to see, but on the whole he thought it better to hold his fire until he had more to aim at than a few hundred fuzzy heads peeping over a razor-back ridge. He was a bulky, red-faced man, a fine whist player, and a soldier who knew his work. Men believed in him. and he had good reason to believe in them, for he had excellent stuff under him that day. Being an ardent champion of the short service system, he took particular care to work with veteran first battalions, and his little force was the compressed essence of an army corps. The left front of the square was formed by 4 companies of the Royal Wessex, and the right by 4 of the Royal Mallows. On either side the other halves of the same regiments marched in quarter column of companies. Behind them on the right was a battalion of Guards, and on the left one of Marines, while the rear was closed in by a rifle battalion. 2 Royal Artillery 7-pound screw guns kept pace with the square, and a dozen white-bloused sailors, under their blue-coated, tight-waisted officers, trailed their Gardner in front, turning every now and then to spit up at the draggled banners which waved over the cragged ridge. Hussars and Lancers scouted in the scrub at each side, and within moved the clump of camels, with humorous eyes and supercilious lips, their comic faces a contrast to the blood-stained men who already lay huddled in the cacolets on the side. The square was now moving slowly on a line parallel with the rocks, stopping every few minutes to pick up wounded, and to allow the screw guns and Gardner to make themselves felt. The men looked serious, for that spring on to the rocks of the Arab army had given them a vague glimpse of the number and the ferocity of their foes. But their faces were set like stone, for they knew to a man that they must win or they must die, and die too in a particularly unlovely fashion. But most serious of all was the general, for he had seen that which brought a flush to his cheeks and a frown to his brow. "I say, Stephen," he said to his galloper, "those Mallows seem a trifle jumpy. The right flank company bulged a bit when the niggers showed on the hill." "The youngest troops in the square, sir," murmured his aide, looking at them critically through his eyeglass. "Tell Colonel Flanagan to see to it, Stephen," said the general, and the galloper sped on his way. The colonel, a fine old Celtic warrior, was over at C Company in an instant. "How are the men, Captain Foley?" "Never better, sir," answered the senior captain, in the spirit that makes a Madras officer look murder if you suggest recruiting his regiment from the Punjab. "Stiffen them up," cried the colonel. As he rode away, a colour sergeant seemed to trip and fell forward into a mimosa bush. He made no effort to rise, but lay in a heap among the thorns. "Sergeant O'Rourke's gone, sir," cried a voice. "Never mind, lads," said Captain Foley. "He died like a soldier, fighting for his queen." "Down with the queen," shouted a hoarse voice from the ranks. But the roar of the Gardner and the typewriter-like clicking of the hopper burst in at the tail of the words. Captain Foley heard them, and subalterns Grice and Murphy heard them. But there are times when a deaf ear is a gift from the gods. "Steady, Mallows," cried the captain in a pause of the grunting machine gun. "We have the honour of Ireland to guard this day." "And well we know how to guard it, captain," cried the same ominous voice, and there was a buzz from the length of the company. The captain and the 2 subs came together behind the marching line. "They seem a bit out of hand," murmured the captain. "Bedad," said the Galway boy, "they mean to scoot like Redshanks." "They nearly broke when the blacks showed on the hill," said Grice. "The first man that turns, my sword is through him," cried Foley, loud enough to be heard by 5 files on either side of him. Then, in a lower voice, "It's a bitter drop to swallow, but it's my duty to report what you think to the chief, and have a company of Jollies put behind us." He turned away with the safety of the square upon his mind, and before he had reached his goal the square had ceased to exist. In their march in front of what looked like a face of a cliff, they had come opposite to the mouth of the gully, in which, screened by scrub and boulders, 3,000 chosen dervishes under Hamid Wad Hussein of the Baggaras were crouching. Tap, tap, tap went the rifles of 3 mounted infantrymen in the front and left shoulder of the square, and an instant later they were spurring it for their lives, crouching over the manes of their horses, and pelting over the sandhills with 30 or 40 galloping chieftains at their heels. Rocks and scrub and mimosa swarmed suddenly into life. Rushing black figures came and went in the gaps of the bushes. A howl that drowned the shouts of the officers, a long quavering yell burst from the ambuscade. 2 rolling volleys from the Royal Wessex, 1 crash from the screw gun firing shrapnel, and then, before a second cartridge could be rammed in, a living, glistening black wave, tipped with steel, had rolled over the gun. The Royal Wessex had been dashed back among the camels, and 1,000 fanatics were hewing and hacking in the heart of what had been the square. The camels and mules in the centre jammed more and more together as their leaders flinched from the rush of the tribesmen, shut out the view of the other three faces, who could only tell that the Arabs had got in by the yells upon Allah, which rose ever nearer and nearer amid the clouds of sand dust, the struggling animals, and the dense mass of swaying, cursing men. Some of the Wessex fired back at the Arabs who had passed them, as excited Tommy's will, and it is whispered among doctors that it was not always a Remington bullet which was cut from a wound that day. Some rallied in little knots, stabbing furiously with their bayonets at the rushing spearmen. Others turned at bay with their backs against the camels, and others round the general and his staff, who, revolver in hand, had flung themselves into the heart of it. But the whole square was sliding slowly away from the gorge, pushed back by the pressure at the shattered corner. The officers and men at the other faces were glancing nervously to the rear, uncertain what was going on, and unable to take help to their comrades without breaking the formation. "By Jove, they've got through the Wessex!" cried Grice of the Mallows. "The devils have a roast us, Ted," said his brother subaltern, cocking his revolver. The ranks were breaking down, and crowding towards Private Conolly, all talking together as the officers peered back through the veil of dust. The sailors had run their Gardner out, and she was squirting death out of her 5 barrels into the flank of the rushing stream of savages. "Oh, this bloody gun!" shouted a voice. "She's jammed again." The fierce metallic grunting had ceased, and her crew were straining and hauling at the breech. "This damned vertical feed!" cried an officer. "The spanner, Wilson, the spanner! Stand to your cutlasses, boys, or they're into us." His voice rose into a shriek as he ended, for a shovel-headed spear had been buried in his chest. A second wave of dervishes lapped over the hillocks and burst upon the machine gun and the right of the front line. The sailors were overborne in an instant, but the Mallows, with their fighting blood aflame, met the yell of the Moslem men with an even wilder, fiercer cry, and dropped 200 of them with a single point-blank volley. The howling, leaping crew swerved away to the right and dashed on into the gap which had already been made for them. But C Company had drawn no trigger to stop that fiery rush. The men leaned moodily upon their martinis. Some had even thrown them upon the ground. Conolly was talking fiercely to those about him. Captain Foley, thrusting his way through the press, rushed up to him with a revolver in his hand. "This is your doing, you villain," he cried. "If you raise your pistol, Captain, your brains will be all over your coat," said a low voice at his side. He saw that several rifles were turned on him. The 2 subs had pressed forward and were by his side. "What is it, then?" he cried, looking round from one fierce, mutinous face to another. "Are you Irishmen? Are you soldiers? What are you here for but to fight for your country?" "England is no country of ours," cried several. "You're not fighting for England. You're fighting for Ireland, and for the empire of which it is a part." "A black curse on the empire!" shouted Private Maguire, throwing down his rifle. "'Twas the empire that backed the man that druv me onto the roadside. May me hands stiffen before I draw a trigger for it." "What's the empire to us, Captain Foley, and what's the Widdy to us either?" cried a voice. "Let the constabulary fight for her." "Ay, begod, they'd be better employed than pulling a poor man's thatch about his ears, or shooting his brother as they did mine. It was the empire that laid my groaning mother by the wayside. Her son will rot before he'll uphold it, and you can put that in the charge sheet in the next court martial." In vain the 3 officers begged, menaced, and persuaded. The square was still moving, ever moving, with the same bloody fight raging in its entrails. Even while they had been speaking, they had been shuffling backwards, and the useless Gardner with her slaughtered crew was already a good 100 yards from them, and the pace was accelerating. The mass of men, tormented and writhing, was trying by a common instinct to reach some clearer ground where they could reform. 3 faces were still intact, but the 4th had been caved in and badly mauled, without its comrades being able to help it. The guards had met a fresh rush of the Hadendowas, and had blown back the tribesmen with a volley, and the cavalry had ridden over another stream of them as they welled out of the gully. A litter of hamstrung horses and haggled men behind them showed that a spearman on his face among the bushes can show some sport to the man who charges him. But in spite of all, the square was still reeling swiftly backwards, trying to shake itself clear of this torment which clung to its heart. Would it break, or would it reform? The lives of 5 regiments and the honour of the flag hung upon the answer. Some at least were breaking. The C Company of the Mallows had lost all military order, and was pushing back in spite of the haggard officers who cursed and shoved and prayed in the vain attempt to hold them. The captain and the subs were elbowed and jostled, while the men crowded towards Private Conolly for their orders. The confusion had not spread, for the other companies, in the dust and smoke and turmoil, had lost touch with their mutinous comrades. Captain Foley saw that even now there might be time to avert a disaster. "Think what you're doing, man," he yelled, rushing towards the ringleader. "There are 1,000 Irish in the square. They are all dead men if we break." The words alone might have had little effect on the old moonlighter. It is possible that in his scheming brain he had already planned how he was to club his Irish together and lead them to the sea. But at that moment the Arabs broke through the screen of camels which had fended them off. There was a struggle, a screaming, a mule rolled over, a wounded man sprang up in a cacolet with a spear through him, and then through the narrow gap surged a stream of naked savages, mad with battle, drunk with slaughter, spotted and splashed with blood dripping from their spears, their arms, and their faces. Their yells, their bounds, their crouching, darting figures, the horrid energy of their spear thrusts, made them look like a blast of fiends from the pit. And were these the allies of Ireland? Were these the men who were to strike for her against her enemies? Conolly's soul rose up in loathing at the thought. He was a man of firm purpose, and yet at the first sight of these howling fiends that purpose faltered, and at the second it was blown to the winds. He saw a huge coal-black negro seize a shrieking camel-driver and saw at his throat with a knife. He saw a shock-headed tribesman plunge his great spear through the back of their own little bugler from Mill Street. He saw a dozen deeds of blood, the murder of the wounded, the hacking of the unarmed, and caught too, in a glance, the good wholesome faces of the faced about rear rank of the Marines. The Mallows too had faced about, and in an instant Conolly had thrown himself into the heart of C Company, striving with the officers to form the men up with their comrades. But the mischief had gone too far. The rank and file had no heart in their work. They had broken before, and this last rush of murderous savages was a hard thing for broken men to stand against. They flinched from the furious faces and dripping forearms. Why should they throw away their lives for a flag for which they cared nothing? Why should their leader urge them to break, and now shriek to them to reform? They would not reform. They wanted to get to the sea and safety. He flung himself among them with outstretched arms and with words of reason, with shouts, with gaspings. It was useless. The tide was beyond his control. They were shredding out into the desert with their faces set for the coast. "Boys, will you stand for this?" screamed a voice. It was so ringing, so strenuous, that the breaking Mallows glanced backward. They were held by what they saw. Private Conolly had planted his rifle stock downward in a mimosa bush. From the fixed bayonet there fluttered a little green flag, with the crownless harp. God knows for what black mutiny, for what signal of revolt, that flag had been treasured up within the corporal's tunic. Now its green wisp stood amid the rush, while the 3 proud regimental colours were reeling slowly backwards. "What for the flag?" yelled the private. "My heart's blood for it." "And mine, and mine," cried a score of voices. "God bless it, the flag, boys, the flag!" C Company were rallying upon it. The stragglers clutched at each other and pointed. "Here, Macquire, Flynn, O'Hara," ran the shoutings. "Close on the flag! Back to the flag!" The 3 standards reeled backwards, and the seething square strove for a clearer space where they could form their shattered ranks. But C Company, grim and powder stained, choked with enemies, and falling fast, still closed in on the little rebel ensign that flapped from the mimosa bush. It was a good half hour before the square, having disentangled itself from its difficulties and dressed its ranks, began to slowly move forwards over the ground across which in its labour and anguish it had been driven. The long trail of Wessex men and Arabs showed but too clearly the path that they had come. "How many got to us, Stephen?" asked the general, tapping his snuff box. "I should put them down at about 1,000 or 1,200, sir." "I did not see any get out again. What the devil were the Wessex thinking about? The Guards stood well, though. So did the Mallows." "Colonel Flanagan reports that his front flank company was cut off, sir." "Why, that's the company that was out of hand when we advanced." "Colonel Flanagan reports, sir, that the company took the whole brunt of the attack, and gave the square time to reform." "Tell the Hussars to ride forward, Stephen," said the General, "and try, if they can, to see anything of them. There's no firing, and I fear that the Mallows will want to do some recruiting. Let the square take ground by the right, and then advance." But the Sheikh Kadra of the Hadendowas saw from his knoll that the men with the big hats had rallied, and that they were coming back in the quiet business fashion of men whose work was before them. He took counsel with Musa the dervish and Hussein of the Baggara, and a woe-struck man was he when he learned that a third of his men were safe in the Moslem paradise. So, having still some signs of victory to show, he gave the word, and the desert warriors flitted off unseen and unheard, even as they had come. A red rock plateau, a few hundred spears and Remingtons, and a plain which for the second time was strewn with slaughtered men, was all that his day's fighting gave to the English general. It was a squadron of hussars which came first to the spot where the rebel flag had waved. A dense litter of Arab dead marked the place. Within, the flag waved no longer, but the rifles stood in the mimosa bush, and round it, with their wounds in front, lay the Fenian private and the silent ranks of the Irishry. Sentiment is not an English failing, but the hussar captain raised his hilt in a salute as he rode past the blood-soaked ring. The British general sent home dispatches to his government, and so did the chief of the Hadendowas, though the style and manner differed somewhat in each. The Sheikh Kadra of the Hadendowa, people to Mohammed Ahmed and the chosen of Allah, homage and greeting, began the latter. Know by this that on the 4th day of this moon we gave battle to the Kafirs, who call themselves Inglees, having with us the chief Hussein with 10,000 of the faithful. By the blessing of Allah we have broken them, and chased them for a mile, though indeed these infidels are different from the dogs of Egypt, and have slain very many of our men. Yet we hope to smite them again ere the new moon be come, to which end I trust that thou wilt send us 1,000 dervishes from Omdurman. In token of our victory, I send you by this messenger a flag which we have taken. By the colour it might well seem to have belonged to those of the true faith, but the Kafirs gave their blood freely to save it, and so we think that, though small, it is very dear to them. End of section 1.
Section 2 of The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Captain Sharkey, Part 1. How the Governor of St. Kitts Came Home. When the great wars of the Spanish Succession had been brought to an end by the Treaty of Utrecht, the vast number of privateers which had been fitted out by the contending parties found their occupation gone. Some took to the more peaceful but less lucrative ways of ordinary commerce, others were absorbed into the fishing fleets, and a few of the more reckless hoisted the Jolly Roger at the mizzen and the Bloody Flag at the main, declaring a private war upon their own account against the whole human race. With mixed crews recruited from every nation, they scoured the seas, disappearing occasionally to careen in some lonely inlet, or putting in for a debauch at some outlying port, where they dazzled the inhabitants by their lavishness, and horrified them by their brutalities. On the Coromandel coast, at Madagascar, in the African waters, and above all in the West Indian and American seas, the pirates were a constant menace. With an insolent luxury they would regulate their depredations by the comfort of the seasons, harrying New England in the summer, and dropping south again to the tropical islands in the winter. They were the more to be dreaded because they had none of that discipline and restraint which made their predecessors, the buccaneers, both formidable and respectable. These Ishmaels of the sea rendered an account to no man, and treated their prisoners according to the drunken whim of the moment. Flashes of grotesque generosity alternated with longer stretches of inconceivable ferocity, and the skipper who fell into their hands might find himself dismissed with his cargo, after serving as boon companion in some hideous debauch, or might sit at his cabin table with his own nose and his lips served up with pepper and salt in front of him. It took a stout seaman in those days to ply his calling in the Caribbean Gulf. Such a man was Captain John Scarrow of the ship Morning Star, and yet he breathed a long sigh of relief when he heard the splash of the falling anchor and swung at his moorings within 100 yards of the guns of the citadel of Basseterre. St. Kitts was his final port of call, and early next morning his bowsprit would be pointed for Old England. He had had enough of those robber-haunted seas. Ever since he had left Maracaibo upon the Main, with his full lading of sugar and red pepper, he had winced at every topsail which glimmered over the violet edge of the tropical sea. He had coasted up the Windward Islands, touching here and there, and assailed continually by stories of villainy and outrage. Captain Sharkey, of the 20-gun pirate barque Happy Delivery, had passed down the coast, and had littered it with gutted vessels and with murdered men. Dreadful anecdotes were current of his grim pleasantries and of his inflexible ferocity. From the Bahamas to the Main, his coal-black barque, with the ambiguous name, had been freighted with death and many things which are worse than death. So nervous was Captain Scarrow, with his new full-rigged ship and her full and valuable lading, that he struck out to the west as far as Bird's Island to be out of the usual track of commerce. And yet even in those solitary waters he had been unable to shake off sinister traces of Captain Sharkey. One morning they had raised a single skiff adrift upon the face of the ocean. Its only occupant was a delirious seaman, who yelled hoarsely as they hoisted him aboard, and showed a dried-up tongue like a black and wrinkled fungus at the back of his mouth. Water and nursing soon transformed him into the strongest and smartest sailor on the ship. He was from Marblehead in New England, it seemed, and was the sole survivor of a schooner which had been scuttled by the dreadful Sharkey. For a week Hiram Evanson, for that was his name, had been adrift beneath a tropical sun. Sharkey had ordered the mangled remains of his late captain to be thrown into the boat, as provisions for the voyage, but the seaman had at once committed it to the deep, lest the temptation should be more than he could bear. He had lived upon his own huge frame until, at the last moment, the Morning Star had found him in that madness which is the precursor of such a death. It was no bad find for Captain Scarrow, for, with a short-handed crew, such a seaman as this big New Englander was a prize worth having. He vowed that he was the only man whom Captain Sharkey had ever placed under an obligation. Now that they lay under the guns of the Basseterre, all danger from the pirate was at an end, and yet the thought of him lay heavily upon the seaman's mind as he watched the agent's boat shooting out from the custom-house quay. "I'll lay you a wager, Morgan," said he to the first mate, "that the agent will speak of Sharkey in the first 100 words that pass his lips." "Well, captain, I'll have you a silver dollar and chance it," said the rough old Bristol man beside him. The negro rowers shot the boat alongside, and the linen-clad steersman sprang up the ladder. "Welcome, Captain Scarrow," he cried. "Have you heard about Sharkey?" The captain grinned at the mate. "What devilry has he been up to now?" he asked. "Devilry? You've not heard, then? Why, we've got him safe under lock and key at Basseterre. He was tried last Wednesday, and he is to be hanged to-morrow morning." Captain and mate gave a shout of joy, which an instant later was taken up by the crew. Discipline was forgotten as they scrambled up through the break of the poop to hear the news. The New Englander was in front of them with a radiant face turned up to heaven, for he came of the Puritan stock. "Sharkey to be hanged!" he cried. "You don't know, Master Agent, if they lack a hangman, do you?" "Stand back!" cried the mate, whose outraged sense of discipline was even stronger than his interest at the news. "I'll pay that dollar, Captain Scarrow, with the lightest heart that ever I paid a wager yet. How came the villain to be taken?" "Why, as to that, he became more than his own comrades would abide, and they took such a horror of him that they would not have him on the ship. So they marooned him upon the Little Mangles to the south of the Mysteriosa Bank, and there he was found by a Portobello trader, who brought him in. There was talk of sending him to Jamaica to be tried, but our good little governor, Sir Charles Ewan, would not hear of it. 'He's my meat,' said he, 'and I claim the cooking of it.' If you can stay till tomorrow morning at 10, you'll see the joint swinging." "I wish I could," said the captain wistfully, "but I am sadly behind time now. I should start with the evening tide." "That you can't do," said the agent with decision. "The governor is going back with you." "The governor?" "Yes. He's had a dispatch from Government to return without delay. The flyboat that brought it has gone on to Virginia. So Sir Charles has been waiting for you, and I told him you were due before the rains." "Well, well," cried the captain in some perplexity. "I'm a plain seaman, and I don't know much of governors and baronets and their ways. I don't remember that I ever so much as spoke to one. But if it's in King George's service, and he asks a cast in the Morning Star as far as London, I'll do what I can for him. There's my own cabin he can have and welcome. As to the cooking, it's lobscouse and salmagundy 6 days in the week, but he can bring his own cook aboard with him if he thinks our galley too rough for his taste." "You need not trouble your mind, Captain Scarrow," said the agent. "Sir Charles is in weak health just now, only clear of a quartan ague, and it is likely he will keep his cabin most of the voyage. Dr. Larousse said that he would have sunk had the hanging of Sharkey not put fresh life into him. He has a great spirit in him, though, and you must not blame him if he is somewhat short in his speech." "He may say what he likes and do what he likes, so long as he does not come athwart my hawse when I am working the ship," said the captain. "He is Governor of St. Kitt's, but I am Governor of the Morning Star, and, by his leave, I must weigh with the first tide, for I owe a duty to my employer, just as he does to King George." "He can scarcely be ready to-night, for he has many things to set in order before he leaves." "The early morning tide, then." "Very good. I shall send his things aboard to-night, and he will follow them to-morrow early, if I can prevail upon him to leave St. Kitt's without seeing Sharkey do the rogue's hornpipe. His own orders were instant, so it may be that he will come at once. It is likely that Dr. Larousse may attend him upon the journey." Left to themselves, the captain and mate made the best preparations which they could for their illustrious passenger. The largest cabin was turned out and adorned in his honour, and orders were given by which barrels of fruit and some cases of wine should be brought off to vary the plain food of an ocean-going trader. In the evening the governor's baggage began to arrive, great iron-bound, ant-proof trunks, and official tin packing-cases, with other strange-shaped packages, which suggested the cocked hat or the sword within. And then there came a note, with a heraldic device upon the big red seal, to say that Sir Charles Ewan made his compliments to Captain Scarrow, and that he hoped to be with him in the morning as early as his duties and his infirmities would permit. He was as good as his word, for the first grey of dawn had hardly begun to deepen into pink when he was brought alongside and climbed with some difficulty up the ladder. The captain had heard that the governor was an eccentric, but he was hardly prepared for the curious figure who came limping feebly down his quarter-deck, his steps supported by a thick bamboo cane. He wore a Ramillies wig, all twisted into little tails like a poodle's coat, and cut so low across the brow that the large green glasses which covered his eyes looked as if they were hung from it. A fierce beak of a nose, very long and very thin, cut the air in front of him. His ague had caused him to swathe his throat and chin with a broad linen cravat, and he wore a loose damask powdering gown secured by a cord round the waist. As he advanced, he carried his masterful nose high in the air, but his head turned slowly from side to side in the helpless manner of the purblind, and he called in a high, querulous voice for the captain. "You have my things?" he asked. "Yes, Sir Charles." "Have you wine aboard?" "I have ordered 5 cases, sir." "And tobacco?" "There's a keg of Trinidad." "You play a hand at piquet?" "Passably well, sir." "Then anchor up, and to sea." There was a fresh westerly wind, so by the time the sun was fairly through the morning haze, the ship was hull down from the islands. The decrepit governor still limped the deck with one guiding hand upon the quarter-rail. "You are on Government service now, Captain," said he. "They are counting the days till I come to Westminster, I promise you. Have you all that she will carry?" "Every inch, Sir Charles." "Keep her so if you blow the sails out of her. I fear, Captain Scarrow, that you will find a blind and broken man a poor companion for your voyage." "I am honoured in enjoying your Excellency's society," said the captain. But I am sorry that your eyes should be so afflicted." "Yes, indeed. It is the cursed glare of the sun on the white streets of Basseterre which has gone far to burn them out." "I had heard also that you had been plagued by a quartan ague." "Yes. I have had pyrexy, which has reduced me much." "We had set aside a cabin for your surgeon." "Ah, the rascal! There was no budging him, for he has a snug business amongst the merchants. But hark!" He raised his ring-covered band in the air. From far astern there came the low, deep thunder of cannon. "It is from the island!" cried the captain in astonishment. "Can it be a signal for us to put back?" The Governor laughed. "You have heard that Sharkey the pirate is to be hanged this morning. I ordered the batteries to salute when the rascal was kicking his last, so that I might know of it out at sea. There's an end of Sharkey!" "There's an end of Sharkey!" cried the captain, and the crew took up the cry as they gathered in little knots upon the deck and stared back at the low purple line of the vanishing land. It was a cheering omen for their start across the Western Ocean, and the invalid Governor found himself a popular man on board, for it was generally understood that but for his insistence upon an immediate trial and sentence, the villain might have played upon some more venal judge and so escaped. At dinner that day Sir Charles gave many anecdotes of the deceased pirate, and so affable was he, and so skilful in adapting his conversation to men of lower degree, that captain, mate, and governor smoked their long pipes and drank their claret as three good comrades should. "And what figure did Sharkey cut in the dock?" asked the captain. "He is a man of some presence," said the Governor. "I had always understood that he was an ugly, sneering devil," remarked the mate. "Well, I dare say he could look ugly upon occasions," said the Governor. "I have heard a New Bedford whaleman say that he could not forget his eyes," said Captain Scarrow. "They were of the lightest filmy blue, with red-rimmed lids. Was that not so, Sir Charles? Alas, my own eyes will not permit me to know much of those of others. But I remember now that the Adjutant General said that he had such an eye as you describe, and added that the jury was so foolish as to be visibly discomposed when it was turned upon them. It is well for them that he is dead, for he was a man who would never forget an injury, and if he had laid hands upon any one of them, he would have stuffed him with straw and hung him for a figurehead." The idea seemed to amuse the Governor, for he broke suddenly into a high neighing laugh, and the two seamen laughed also, but not so heartily, for they remembered that Sharkey was not the last pirate who sailed the western seas, and that as grotesque a fate might come to be their own. Another bottle was broached to drink to a pleasant voyage, and the Governor would drink just one other on the top of it, so that the seamen were glad at last to stagger off, the one to his watch and the other to his bunk. But when, after his 4 hours' spell, the mate came down again, he was amazed to see the Governor, in his Ramillies wig, his glasses, and his powdering gown, still seated sedately at the lonely table with his reeking pipe and 6 black bottles by his side. "I have drunk with the Governor of St. Kitt's when he was sick," said he, "and God forbid that I should ever try to keep pace with him when he is well." The voyage of the Morning Star was a successful one, and in about 3 weeks she was at the mouth of the British Channel. From the first day the infirm Governor had begun to recover his strength, and before they were half-way across the Atlantic he was, save only for his eyes, as well as any man upon the ship. Those who uphold the nourishing qualities of wine might point to him in triumph, for never a night passed that he did not repeat the performance of his first one. And yet he would be out upon deck in the early morning as fresh and brisk as the best of them, peering about with his weak eyes and asking questions about the sails and the rigging, for he was anxious to learn the ways of the sea. And he made up for the deficiency of his eyes by obtaining leave from the captain that the New England seaman, he who had been cast away in the boat, should lead him about, and above all, that he should sit beside him when he played cards and count the number of the pips, for unaided he could not tell the king from the knave. It was natural that this Evanson should do the Governor willing service, since the one was the victim of the vile Sharkey, and the other was his avenger. One could see that it was a pleasure to the big American to lend his arm to the invalid, and at night he would stand with all respect behind his chair in the cabin and lay his great stub-nailed forefinger upon the card which he should play. Between them there was little in the pockets either of Captain Scarrow or of Morgan, the first mate, by the time they sighted the Lizard. And it was not long before they found that all they had heard of the high temper of Sir Charles Ewan fell short of the mark. At a sign of opposition or a word of argument, his chin would shoot out from his cravat, his masterful nose would be cocked at a higher and more insolent angle, and his bamboo cane would whistle up over his shoulders. He cracked it once over the head of the carpenter when the man had accidentally jostled him upon the deck. Once, too, when there was some grumbling and talk of mutiny over a state of the provisions, he was of the opinion that they should not wait for the dogs to rise, but that they should march forward and set upon them until they had trounced the devilment out of them. "Give me a knife and a bucket," he cried with an oath, and could hardly be withheld from setting forth alone to deal with the spokesman of the seamen. Captain Scarrow had to remind him that though he might be only answerable to himself at St. Kitt's, killing became murder upon the high seas. In politics he was, as became his official position, a stout prop of the House of Hanover, and he swore in his cups that he had never met a Jacobite without pistolling him where he stood. Yet for all his vapouring and his violence, he was so good a companion, with such a stream of strange anecdote and reminiscence, that Scarrow and Morgan had never known a voyage pass so pleasantly. And then at length came the last day when, after passing the island, they had struck land again at the high white cliffs at Beachy Head. As evening fell, the ship lay rolling in an oily calm, a league off from Winchelsea, with the long dark snout of Dungeness jutting out in front of her. Next morning they would pick up their pilot at the Foreland, and Sir Charles might meet the King's ministers at Westminster before the evening. The boatswain had the watch, and the three friends were met for a last turn of cards in the cabin, the faithful American still serving his eyes to the Governor. There was a good stake upon the table, for the sailors had tried on this last night to win their losses back from their passenger. Suddenly he threw his cards down, and slipped all the money into the pocket of his long-flapped silken waistcoat. "The game's mine," said he. "Sir Charles, not so fast," cried Captain Scarrow. "You have not played out the hand, and we are not the losers." "Sink you for a liar," said the Governor. "I tell you I have played out the hand, and that you are a loser." He whipped off his wig and his glasses as he spoke, and there was a high, bald forehead, and a pair of shifty blue eyes, with the red rims of a bull terrier. "Good God!" cried the mate. "It's Sharkey!" The two sailors sprang from their seats, but the big American castaway had put his huge back against the cabin door, and he held a pistol in each of his hands. The passenger had also laid a pistol upon the scattered cards in front of him, and he burst into his high, neighing laugh. "Captain Sharkey is the name, gentlemen," said he, "and this is Roaring Ned Galloway, the quartermaster of the Happy Delivery. We made it hot, and so they marooned us, me on a dry Tortuga Cay, and him on an oarless boat. You dogs, you poor, fond, water-hearted dogs, we hold you at the end of our pistols." "You may shoot or you may not," cried Scarrow, striking his hand upon the breast of his frieze jacket. "If it's my last breath, Sharkey, I tell you that you are a bloody rogue and miscreant, with a halter and hell fire in store for you." "There's a man of spirit, and one of my own kidney, and he's going to make a very pretty death of it," cried Sharkey. "There's no one aft save the man at the wheel, so you may keep your breath, for you'll need it soon. Is the dinghy astern, Ned?" "Aye, aye, captain." "And the other boats scuttled?" "I board them all in 3 places." "Then we shall have to leave you, Captain Scarrow. You look as if you hadn't quite got your bearings yet. Is there anything you'd like to ask me?" "I believe you're the devil himself!" cried the captain. "Where is the Governor of St. Kitt's?" "When last I saw him, His Excellency was in bed with his throat cut. When I broke prison I learnt from my friends, for Captain Sharkey has those who love him in every port, that the Governor was starting for Europe under a master who had never seen him. I climbed his verandah, and I paid him the little debt that I owed him. Then I came aboard you with such of his things as I had need of, and a pair of glasses to hide these tell-tale eyes of mine, and I have ruffled it as a governor should. Now, Ned, you can get to work upon them." "Help! Help! Watch ahoy!" yelled the mate, but the butt of the pirate's pistol crashed down on his head, and he dropped like a pithed ox. Scarrow rushed for the door, but the sentinel clapped his hand over his mouth and threw his other arm round his waist. "No use, Master Scarrow," said Sharkey. "Let us see you go down on your knees and beg for your life." "I'll see you," cried Scarrow, shaking his mouth clear. "Twist his arm around, Ned." "Now, will you?" "No, not if you twist it off. Put an inch of your knife into him." "You may put 6 inches, and then I won't." "Sink me, but I like his spirit," cried Sharkey. "Put your knife in your pocket, Ned. You've saved your skin, Scarrow, and it's a pity so stout a man should not take to the only trade where a pretty fellow can pick up a living. You must be born for no common death, Scarrow, since you have lain at my mercy and lived to tell the story. Tie him up, Ned." "To the stove, Captain?" "Tut, tut! There's a fire in the stove. None of your rover tricks, Ned Galloway, unless they are called for, or I'll let you know which of us two is captain and which is quartermaster. Make him fast to the table." "Nay, I thought you meant to roast him," said the quartermaster. "You surely do not mean to let him go?" "If you and I were marooned on a Bahama Cay, Ned Galloway, it is still for me to command and for you to obey. Sink you for a villain. Do you dare to question my orders?" "Nay, nay, Captain Sharkey, not so hot, sir," said the quartermaster, and, lifting Scarrow like a child, he laid him on the table. With the quick dexterity of a seaman, he tied his spread-eagled hands and feet with a rope which was passed underneath, and gagged him securely with the long cravat which was used to adorn the chin of the Governor of St. Kitts. "Now, Captain Scarrow, we must take our leave of you," said the pirate. "If I had half a dozen of my brisk boys at my heels, I should have your cargo and your ship, but Roaring Ned could not find a foremast hand with the spirit of a mouse. I see there are some small craft about, and we shall get one of them. When Captain Sharkey has a boat, he can get a smack. When he has a smack, he can get a brig. When he has a brig, he can get a barque, and when he has a barque, he'll soon have a full-rigged ship of his own. So make haste into London town, or I may be coming back after all for the Morning Star." Captain Scarrow heard the key turn in the lock as they left the cabin. Then, as he strained at his bonds, he heard their footsteps pass up the companion and along the quarter-deck to where the dinghy hung in the stern. Then, still struggling and writhing, he heard the creak of the falls and the splash of the boat in the water. In a mad fury he tore and dragged at his ropes until at last, with flayed wrists and ankles, he rolled from the table, sprang over the dead mate, kicked his way through the closed door, and rushed hatless on to the deck. "Ahoy! Peterson! Armitage! Wilson!" he screamed. "Cutlasses and pistols! Clear away the long-boat! Clear away the gig! Sharkey the pirate is in yonder dinghy! Whistle up the larboard watch, bo'sun, and tumble into the boats, all hands!" Down splashed the long-boat, and down splashed the gig, but in an instant the coxswains and crews were swarming up the falls on to the deck once more. "The boats are scuttled!" they cried. "They are leaking like a sieve!" The captain gave a bitter curse. He had been beaten and outwitted at every point. Above was a cloudless, starlit sky, with neither wind nor the promise of it. The sails flapped idly in the moonlight. Far away lay a fishing smack, with the men clustering over their nets. Close to them was the little dinghy, dipping and lifting over the shining swell. "They are dead men!" cried the captain. "A shout all together, boys, to warn them of their danger!" But it was too late. At that very moment the dinghy shot into the shadow of the fishing boat. There were 2 rapid pistol shots, a scream, and then another pistol shot, followed by silence. The clustering fishermen had disappeared, and then suddenly, as the first puffs of a land breeze came out from the Sussex shore, the boom swung out, the mainsail filled, and the little craft crept out with her nose to the Atlantic. End of Part 1. Section 3 of The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Part 2. The Dealings of Captain Sharkey with Stephen Craddock. Careening was a very necessary operation for the old pirate, on whose superior speed he depended both for overhauling the trader and escaping the man of war. but it was impossible to retain his sailing qualities unless he periodically, once a year at least, cleared his vessel's bottom from the long trailing plants and crusting barnacles which gather so rapidly in the tropical seas. For this purpose he lightened his vessel, thrust her into some narrow inlet where she would be left high and dry at low water, fastened blocks and tackles to her masts to pull her over onto her bilge, and then scraped her thoroughly from rudder post to cutwater. During the weeks which were thus occupied the ship was, of course, defenceless, but, on the other hand, she was unapproachable by anything heavier than an empty hull, and the place for careening was chosen with an eye to secrecy, so that there was no great danger. So secure did the captains feel that it was not uncommon for them at such times to leave their ships under a sufficient guard, and to start off in the long-boat, either upon a sporting expedition or, more frequently, upon a visit to some outlying town, where they burned the heads of the women by their swaggering gallantry, or broached pipes of wine in the market square, with a threat to pistol all who would not drink with them. Sometimes they would even appear in cities of the size of Charleston, and walk the streets with their clattering side-arms, an open scandal to the whole law-abiding colony. Such visits were not always paid with impunity. It was one of them, for example, which provoked Lieutenant Maynard to hack off Blackbeard's head, and to spear it upon the end of his bowsprit. But, as a rule, the pirate ruffled and bullied and drabbed without let or hindrance, until it was time for him to go back to his ship once more. There was one pirate, however, who never crossed even the skirts of civilization, and that was the sinister Sharkey of the barque Happy Delivery. It may have been from his morose and solitary temper, or, as is more probable, that he knew that his name upon the coast was such that outraged humanity would, against all odds, have thrown themselves upon him, but never once did he show his face in a settlement. When his ship was laid up, he would leave her under the charge of Ned Galloway, her New England quartermaster, and would take long voyages in his boat sometimes, it was said, for the purpose of bearing his share of the plunder, and sometimes to shoot the wild oxen of Hispaniola, which, when dressed and barbecued, provided provisions for his next voyage. In the latter case the barque would come round to some prearranged spot to pick him up, and take on board what he had shot. There had always been a hope in the islands that Sharkey might be taken on one of these occasions, and at last there came news to Kingston which seemed to justify an attempt upon him. It was brought by an elderly logwood cutter who had fallen into the pirates' hands, and in some freak of drunken benevolence had been allowed to get away with nothing worse than a slit nose and a drubbing. His account was recent and definite. The Happy Delivery was careening at Torbec on the southwest of Hispaniola. Sharkey, with 4 men, was buccaneering on the outlying island of Lavache. The blood of 100 murdered crews was calling out for vengeance, and now at last it seemed as if it might not call in vain. Sir Edward Compton, the high-nosed, red-faced governor, sitting in solemn conclave with the commandant and the head of the council, was sorely puzzled in his mind as to how he should use this chance. There was no man-of-war nearer than Jamestown, and she was a clumsy old flyboat, which could neither overhaul the pirate on the seas nor reach her in a shallow inlet. There were forts and artillerymen both at Kingston and Port Royal, but no soldiers available for an expedition. A private venture might be fitted out, and there were many who had a blood feud with Sharkey. But what could a private venture do? The pirates were numerous and desperate. As to taking Sharkey and his 4 companions, that, of course, would be easy, if they could get at them. But how were they to get at them on a large, well-wooded island like Lavache, full of wild hills and impenetrable jungles? A reward was offered to whoever could find a solution, and that brought a man to the front who had a singular plan, and was himself prepared to carry it out. Stephen Craddock had been that most formidable person, the Puritan gone wrong. Sprung from a decent Salem family, his ill-doing seemed to be a recoil from the austerity of their religion, and he brought to vice all the physical strength and energy with which the virtues of his ancestors had endowed him. He was ingenious, fearless, and exceedingly tenacious of purpose, so that when he was still young his name became notorious upon the American coast. He was the same Craddock who was tried for his life in Virginia for the slaying of the Seminole chief, and though he escaped, it is well known that he had corrupted the witnesses and bribed the judge. Afterwards, as a slaver, and even, as it was hinted, as a pirate, he had left an evil name behind him in the Bight of Benin. Finally, he had returned to Jamaica with a considerable fortune, and had settled down to a life of sombre dissipation. This was the man, gaunt, austere, and dangerous, who now waited upon the Governor with a plan for the extirpation of Sharkey. Sir Edward received him with little enthusiasm, for in spite of some rumours of conversion and reformation, he had always regarded him as an infected sheep who might taint the whole of his little flock. Craddock saw the Governor's mistrust under his thin veil of formal and restrained courtesy. "You've no call to fear me, sir," said he. "I'm a changed man from what you've known. I've seen the light again of late, after losing sight of it for many a black year. It was through the ministration of the Reverend John Simmons, of our own people. Sir, if your spirit should be in need of quickening, you would find a very sweet savour in his discourse." The Governor cocked his Episcopalian nose at him. "You came here to speak of Sharkey, Master Craddock," said he. "The man Sharkey is a vessel of wrath," said Craddock. "His wicked horn has been exalted overlong, and it is borne in upon me that if I can cut him off and utterly destroy him, it will be a goodly deed, and one which may atone for many backslidings in the past. A plan has been given to me whereby I may encompass his destruction." The Governor was keenly interested, for there was a grim and practical air about the man's freckled face which showed that he was in earnest. After all, he was a seaman and a fighter, and if it was true that he was eager to atone for his past, no better man could be chosen for the business. "This will be a dangerous task, Master Craddock," said he. "If I meet my death at it, it may be that it will cleanse the memory of an ill-spent life. I have much to atone for." The Governor did not see his way to contradict him. "What was your plan?" he asked. "You have heard that Sharkey's barque, the Happy Delivery, came from this very port of Kingston?" "It belonged to Mr. Cordington, and it was taken by Sharkey, who scuttled his own sloop and moved into her because she was faster," said Sir Edward. "Yes, but it may be that you have never heard that Mr. Codrington has a sister ship, the White Rose, which lies even now in the harbour, and which is so like the pirate that if it were not for a white paint line, none could tell them apart." "Ah, and what of that?" asked the Governor keenly, with the air of one who is just on the edge of an idea. "By the help of it, this man shall be delivered into our hands." "And how?" "I will paint out the streak upon the White Rose, and make it in all things like the Happy Delivery. Then I will set sail for the island of Lavache, where this man is slaying the wild oxen. When he sees me he will surely mistake me for his own vessel which he is awaiting, and he will come on board to his own undoing." It was a simple plan, and yet it seemed to the Governor that it might be effective. Without hesitation he gave Craddock permission to carry it out, and to take any steps he liked in order to further the object which he had in view. Sir Edward was not very sanguine, for many attempts had been made upon Sharkey, and their result had shown that he was as cunning as he was ruthless. But this gaunt Puritan with the evil record was cunning and ruthless also. The contest of wits between two such men as Sharkey and Craddock appealed to the Governor's acute sense of sport, and though he was inwardly convinced that the chances were against him, he backed his man with the same loyalty which he would have shown to his horse or his cock. Haste was, above all things, necessary, for upon any day the careening might be finished, and the pirates out at sea once more. But there was not very much to do, and there were many willing hands to do it, so the second day saw the White Rose beating out for the open sea. There were many seamen in the port who knew the lines and rig of the pirate barque, and not one of them could see the slightest difference in this counterfeit. Her white side line had been painted out, her masts and yards were smoked, to give them the dingy appearance of the weather-beaten rover, and a large diamond-shaped patch was let into her foretopsail. Her crew were volunteers, many of them being men who had sailed with Stephen Craddock before. The mate, Joshua Hurd, an old slaver, had been his accomplice in many voyages, and came now at the bidding of his chief. The avenging barque sped across the Caribbean Sea, and at the sight of that patched topsail the little craft which they met flew left and right like frightened trout in a pool. On the fourth evening Point Abaku bore 5 miles to the north and east of them. On the fifth they were at anchor in the Bay of Tortoises at the island of Lavache, where Sharkey and his 4 men had been hunting. It was a well-wooded place, with the palms and underwood growing down to the thin crescent of silver sand which skirted the shore. They had hoisted the black flag and the red pennant, but no answer came from the shore. Craddock strained his eyes, hoping every instant to see a boat shoot out to them with Sharkey seated in the sheets. But the night passed away, and a day, and yet another night, without any sign of the men whom they were endeavouring to trap. It looked as if they were already gone. On the second morning Craddock went ashore in search of some proof whether Sharkey and his men were still upon the island. What he found reassured him greatly. Close to the shore was a boucan of green wood, such as was used for preserving the meat, and a great store of barbecued strips of ox flesh was hung upon lines all around it. The pirate ship had not taken off her provisions, and therefore the hunters were still upon the island. Why had they not shown themselves? Was it that they had detected that this was not their own ship? Or was it that they were hunting in the interior of the island, and were not on the lookout for a ship yet? Craddock was still hesitating between the two alternatives when a Carib Indian came down with information. The pirates were in the island, he said, and their camp was a day's march from the sea. They had stolen his wife, and the marks of their stripes were still pink upon his brown back. Their enemies were his friends, and he would lead them to where they lay. Craddock could not have asked for anything better. So early next morning, with a small party armed to the teeth, he set off, under the guidance of the Carib. All day they struggled through brushwood and clambered over rocks, pushing their way further and further into the desolate heart of the island. Here and there they found traces of the hunters, the bones of a slain ox, or the marks of feet in a morass, and once, towards evening, it seemed to some of them that they heard the distant rattle of guns. That night they spent under the trees, and pushed on again with the earliest light. About noon they came to the huts of bark, which, the Carib told them, were the camp of the hunters, but they were silent and deserted. No doubt their occupants were away at the hunt, and would return in the evening, so Craddock and his men lay in ambush in the brushwood around them. But no one came, and another night was spent in the forest. Nothing more could be done, and it seemed to Craddock that after the 2 days' absence it was time that he returned to his ship once more. The return journey was less difficult, as they had already blazed a path for themselves. Before evening they found themselves once more at the Bay of Palms, and saw their ship riding at anchor where they had left her. Their boat and oars had been hauled up among the bushes, so they launched it and pulled out to the bark. "No luck, then?" cried Joshua Hurd, the mate, looking down with a pale face from the poop. "His camp was empty, but he may come down to us yet," said Craddock, with his hand on the ladder. Somebody upon deck began to laugh. "I think," said the mate, "that these men had better stay in the boat." "Why so?" "If you will come aboard, sir, you will understand it." He spoke in a curious, hesitating fashion. The blood flushed to Craddock's gaunt face. "How is this, Master Hurd?" he cried, springing up the side. "What mean you by giving orders to my boat's crew?" But as he passed over the bulwarks with one foot upon the deck and one knee upon the rail, a tow-bearded man, whom he had never before observed aboard his vessel, grabbed suddenly at his pistol. Craddock clutched at the fellow's wrist, but at the same instant his mate snatched the cutlass from his side. "What roguery is this?" shouted Craddock, looking furiously around him. But the crew stood in knots about the deck, laughing and whispering amongst themselves without showing any desire to go to his assistance. Even in that hurried glance Craddock noticed that they were dressed in the most singular manner, with long riding coats, full-skirted velvet gowns, and coloured ribands at their knees, more like men of fashion than seamen. As he looked at their grotesque figures, he struck his brow with his clenched fist to be sure that he was awake. The deck seemed to be much dirtier than when he had left it, and there were strange, sun-blackened faces turned upon him from every side. Not one of them did he know, save only Joshua Hurd. Had the ship been captured in his absence? Were these Sharkey's men who were around him? At the thought, he broke furiously away and tried to climb over to his boat, but a dozen hands were on him in an instant, and he was pushed aft through the open door of his own cabin. And it was all different to the cabin which he had left. The floor was different, the ceiling was different, the furniture was different. His had been plain and austere. This was sumptuous and yet dirty, hung with rare velvet curtains splashed with wine stains, and panelled with costly woods which were pocked with pistol marks. On the table was a great chart of the Caribbean Sea, and beside it, with compasses in his hand, sat a clean-shaven, pale-faced man with a fur cap and a claret-coloured coat of damask. Craddock turned white under his freckles as he looked upon the long, thin, high-nostriled nose and the red-rimmed eyes which were turned upon him with the fixed, humorous gaze of the master player who has left his opponent without a move. "Sharkey!" cried Craddock. Sharkey's thin lips opened, and he broke into his high, sniggering laugh. "You fool!" he cried, and leaning over, he stabbed Craddock's shoulder again and again with his compasses. "You poor, dull-witted fool! Would you match yourself against me?" It was not the pain of the wounds, but it was the contempt in Sharkey's voice which turned Craddock into a savage madman. He flew at the pirate, roaring with rage, striking, kicking, writhing, foaming. It took 6 men to drag him down on to the floor amidst the splintered remains of the table, and not one of the 6 who did not bear the prisoner's mark upon him. But Sharkey still surveyed him with the same contemptuous eye. From outside there came the crash of breaking wood and the clamour of startled voices. "What is that?" asked Sharkey. "They have stove the boat with cold shot, and the men are in the water." "Let them stay there," said the pirate. "Now, Craddock, you know where you are. You are aboard my ship, the Happy Delivery, and you lie at my mercy. I knew you for a stout seaman, you rogue, before you took to this long-shore canting. Your hands, then, were no cleaner than my own. Will you sign articles, as your mate has done, and join us, or shall I heave you over to follow your ship's company?" "Where is my ship?" asked Craddock. "Scuttled in the bay." "And the hands?" "In the bay, too." "Then I'm for the bay also." "Huck him and heave him over," said Sharkey. Many rough hands had dragged Craddock out upon deck, and Galloway, the quartermaster, had already drawn his hanger to cripple him, when Sharkey came hurrying from his cabin with an eager face. "We can do better with the hound," he cried. "Seek me if it is not a rare plan. Throw him into the sail room with the irons on, and do you come here, quartermaster, that I may tell you what I have in mind." So Craddock, bruised and wounded in soul and body, was thrown into the dark sail room, so fettered that he could not stir hand or foot, but his northern blood was running strong in his veins, and his grim spirit aspired only to make such an ending as might go some way towards atoning for the evil of his life. All night he lay in the curve of the bilge, listening to the rush of the water and the straining of the timbers, which told him that the ship was at sea and driving fast. In the early morning someone came crawling to him in the darkness over the heap of sails. "Here's rum and biscuits," said the voice of his late mate. "It's at the risk of my life, Master Craddock, that I bring them to you." "It was you who trapped me and caught me as in a snare," cried Craddock. "How shall you answer for what you have done?" "What I did with the point of a knife betwixt my blade bones." "God forgive you for a coward, Joshua Hurd. How came you into their hands?" "Why, Master Craddock, the pirate ship came back from its careening upon the very day that you left us. They laid us aboard, and, short-handed as we were, with the best of the men ashore with you, we could offer but a poor defence. Some were cut down, and they were the happiest. The others were killed afterwards. As to me, I saved my life by signing on with them." "And they scuttled my ship?" "They scuttled her, and then Sharkey and his men, who had been watching us from the brushwood, came off to the ship. His mainyard had been cracked and fished last voyage, so he had suspicions of us, seeing that ours was whole. Then he thought of laying the same trap for you which you had set for him." Craddock groaned. "How came I not to see that fished mainyard?" he muttered. "But whither are we bound?" "We are running north and west." "North and west? Then we are heading back towards Jamaica." "With an 8-knot wind." "Have you heard what they mean to do with me?" "I have not heard. If you would but sign the articles—" "Enough, Joshua Hurd. I have risked my soul too often." "As you wish. I have done what I could. Farewell." All that night and the next day the Happy Delivery ran before the easterly trades, and Stephen Craddock lay in the dark of the sail room working patiently at his wrist irons. One he had slipped off at the cost of a row of broken and bleeding knuckles, but do what he would, he could not free the other, and his ankles were securely fastened. From hour to hour he heard the swish of the water, and knew that the barque must be driving with all set in front of the trade wind. In that case they must be nearly back again to Jamaica by now. What plan could Sharkey have in his head, and what use did he hope to make of him? Craddock set his teeth, and vowed that if he had once been a villain from choice, he would, at least, never be one by compulsion. On the second morning Craddock became aware that sail had been reduced in the vessel, and that she was tacking slowly with a light breeze on her beam. The varying slope of the sail room and the sounds from the deck told his practised senses exactly what she was doing. The short reaches showed him that she was manoeuvring near shore and making for some definite point. If so, she must have reached Jamaica. But what could she be doing there? And then suddenly there was a burst of hearty cheering from the deck, and then the crash of a gun above his head, and then the answering booming of guns from far over the water. Craddock sat up and strained his ears. Was the ship in action? Only the one gun had been fired, and though many had answered, there were none of the crashings which told of a shot coming home. Then, if it was not in action, it must be a salute. But who would salute Sharkey the pirate? It could only be another pirate ship which would do so. So Craddock lay back again with a groan, and continued to work at the manacle which still held his right wrist. But suddenly there came the shuffling of steps outside, and he had hardly time to wrap the loose links round his free hand when the door was unbolted and two pirates came in. "Got your hammer, carpenter?" asked one, whom Craddock recognised as the big quartermaster. "Knock off his leg shackles, then. Better leave the bracelets. He's safer with them on." With hammer and chisel the carpenter loosened the irons. "What are you going to do with me?" asked Craddock. "Come on deck and you'll see." The sailor seized him by the arm and dragged him roughly to the foot of the companion. Above him was a square of blue sky cut across by the mizzen gaff, with the colours flying at the peak. But it was the sight of those colours which struck the breath from Stephen Craddock's lips. For there were two of them, and the British ensign was flying above the Jolly Roger, the honest flag above that of the Rogue. For an instant Craddock stopped in amazement, but a brutal push from the pirates behind drove him up the companion ladder. As he stepped out upon deck, his eyes turned up to the main, and there again were the British colours flying above the red pennant, and all the shrouds and rigging were garlanded with streamers. Had the ship been taken, then? But that was impossible, for there were the pirates clustering in swarms along the port bulwarks, and waving their hats joyously in the air. Most prominent of all was the renegade mate, standing on the forecastle head and gesticulating wildly. Craddock looked over the side to see what they were cheering at, and then in a flash he saw how critical was the moment. On the port bow, and about a mile off, lay the white houses and forts of Port Royal, with flags breaking out everywhere over their roofs. Right ahead was the opening of the palisades leading to the town of Kingston. Not more than a quarter of a mile off was a small sloop working out against the very slight wind. The British ensign was at her peak, and her rigging was all decorated. On her deck could be seen a dense crowd of people cheering and waving their hats, and the gleam of scarlet told that there were officers of the garrison among them. In an instant, with the quick perception of a man of action, Craddock saw through it all. Sharkey, with that diabolical cunning and audacity which were among his main characteristics, was simulating the part which Craddock would himself have played had he come back victorious. It was in his honour that the salutes were firing and the flags flying. It was to welcome him that this ship with the governor, the commandant, and the chiefs of the island were approaching. In another 10 minutes they would all be under the guns of the Happy Delivery, and Sharkey would have won the greatest stake that ever a pirate played for yet. "Bring him forward!" cried the pirate captain, as Craddock appeared between the carpenter and the quartermaster. "Keep the ports closed, but clear away the port guns and stand by for a broadside. Another 2 cable links and we have them." "They are edging away," said the boatswain. "I think they smell us." "That's soon set right," said Sharkey, turning his filmy eyes upon Craddock. "Stand there, you, right there, where they can recognise you, with your hand on the guy, and wave your hat to them. Quick, or your brains will be over your coat. Put an inch of your knife into him, Ned. Now, will you wave your hat? Try him again, then. Hey, shoot him! Stop him! But it was too late. Relying upon the manacles, the quartermaster had taken his hands for a moment off Craddock's arm. In that instant he had flung off the carpenter, and, amid a spatter of pistol bullets, had sprung the bulwarks and was swimming for his life. He had been hit and hit again, but it takes many pistols to kill a resolute and powerful man who has his mind set upon doing something before he dies. He was a strong swimmer, and, in spite of the red trail which he left in the water behind him, he was rapidly increasing his distance from the pirate. "Give me a musket!" cried Sharkey with a savage oath. He was a famous shot, and his iron nerve never failed him in an emergency. The dark head appearing on the crest of a roller, and then swooping down on the other side, was already halfway to the sloop. Sharkey dwelt long upon his aim before he fired. With the crack of the gun the swimmer reared himself up in the water, waved his hands in a gesture of warning, and roared out in a voice which rang over the bay. Then, as the sloop swung round her headsails, and the pirate fired an impotent broadside, Stephen Craddock, smiling grimly in his death agony, sank slowly down to that golden couch which glimmered far beneath him. End of Part 2. Section 4 of the Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Part 3. How Copley Banks Slew Captain Sharkey. The Buccaneers were something higher than a mere band of marauders. They were a floating republic, with laws, usages, and discipline of their own. In their endless and remorseless quarrel with the Spaniards, they had some semblance of right upon their side. Their bloody harryings of the cities of the Main were not more barbarous than the inroads of Spain upon the Netherlands, or upon the Caribs in these same American lands. The chief of the Buccaneers, were he English or French, a Morgan or a Grandmont, was still a responsible person, whose country might countenance him or even praise him, so long as he refrained from any deed which might shock the leathery 17th-century conscience too outrageously. Some of them were touched with religion, and it is still remembered how Sawkins threw the dice overboard upon the Sabbath, and Daniel pistoled a man before the altar for irreverence. But there came a day when the fleets of the Buccaneers no longer mustered at the Tortugas, and the solitary and outlawed pirate took their place. Yet even with him the tradition of restraint and of discipline still lingered, and among the early pirates, the Averys, the Englands, and the Robertses, there remained some respect for human sentiment. They were more dangerous to the merchant than to the seaman, but they in turn were replaced by more savage and desperate men, who frankly recognized that they would get no quarter in their war with the human race, and who swore that they would give as little as they got. Of their histories we know little that is trustworthy. They wrote no memoirs and left no trace, save an occasional blackened and blood-stained derelict adrift upon the face of the Atlantic. Their deeds could only be surmised from the long roll of ships who never made their port. Searching the records of history, it is only here and there in an old-world trial that the veil that shrouds them seems for an instant to be lifted, and we catch a glimpse of some amazing and grotesque brutality behind. Such was the breed of Ned Low, of Gow the Scotchman, and of the infamous Sharkey, whose coal-black bark, the Happy Delivery, was known from the Newfoundland banks to the mouths of the Orinoco as the dark forerunner of misery and of death. There were many men, both among the islands and on the Main, who had a blood feud with Sharkey, but not one who had suffered more bitterly than Copley Banks of Kingston. Banks had been one of the leading sugar merchants of the West Indies. He was a man of position, a member of the Council, the husband of a Percival, and the cousin of the Governor of Virginia. His two sons had been sent to London to be educated, and their mother had gone over to bring them back. On their return voyage, the ship, the Duchess of Cornwall, fell into the hands of Sharkey, and the whole family met with an infamous death. Copley Banks said little when he heard the news, but he sank into a morose and enduring melancholy. He neglected his business, avoided his friends, and spent much of his time in the low taverns of the fishermen and seamen. There, amidst riot and devilry, he sat silently puffing at his pipe, with a set face and a smouldering eye. It was generally supposed that his misfortunes had shaken his wits, and his old friends looked at him askance, for the company which he kept was enough to bar him from honest men. From time to time there came rumours of Sharkey over the sea. Sometimes it was from some schooner which had seen a great flame upon the horizon, and approaching to offer help to the burning ship, had fled away at the sight of the sleek black bark lurking like a wolf near a mangled sheep. Sometimes it was a frightened trader, which had come tearing in with her canvas curved like a lady's bodice, because she had seen a patched fore topsail rising slowly above the violet water line. Sometimes it was from a coaster, which had found a waterless Bahama Cay littered with sun-dried bodies. Once there came a man who had been mate of a Guineaman, and who had escaped from the pirates' hands. He could not speak, for reasons which Sharkey could best supply, but he could write, and he did write, to the very great interest of Copley Banks. For hours they sat together over the map, and the dumb man pointed here and there to outlying reefs and tortuous inlets, while his companion sat smoking in silence, with his unvarying face and his fiery eyes. One morning, some 2 years after his misfortunes, Mr. Copley Banks strode into his own office with his old air of energy and alertness. The manager stared at him in surprise, for it was months since he had shown any interest in business. "Good morning, Mr. Banks," said he. "Good morning, Freeman. I see that Ruffling Harry is in the bay." "Yes, sir. She clears for the Windward Islands on Wednesday." "I have other plans for her, Freeman. I have determined upon a slaving venture to Whydah." "But her cargo is ready, sir." "Then it must come out again, Freeman. My mind is made up, and the Ruffling Harry must go slaving to Whydah." All argument and persuasion were vain, so the manager had dolefully to clear the ship once more. And then Copley Banks began to make preparations for his African voyage. It appeared that he relied upon force rather than barter for the filling of his hold, for he carried none of those showy trinkets which savages love, but the brig was fitted with 8 9-pounder guns, and racks full of muskets and cutlasses. The after sail room next the cabin was transformed into a powder magazine, and she carried as many round shot as a well-found privateer. Water and provisions were shipped for a long voyage. But the preparation of his ship's company was most surprising. It made Freeman, the manager, realize that there was truth in the rumour that his master had taken leave of his senses. For under one pretext or another he began to dismiss the old and tried hands, who had served the firm for years, and in their place he embarked the scum of the port, men whose reputations were so vile that the lowest crimp would have been ashamed to furnish them. There was Birthmark Sweetlocks, who was known to have been present at the killing of the logwood cutters, so that his hideous scarlet disfigurement was put down by the fanciful as being a red afterglow from that great crime. He was first mate, and under him was Israel Martin, a little sun-wilted fellow who had served with Howell Davies at the taking of Cape Coast Castle. The crew were chosen from amongst those whom Banks had met and known in their own infamous haunts, and his own table steward was a haggard-faced man who gobbled at you when he tried to talk. His beard had been shaved, and it was impossible to recognise him as the same man whom Sharkey had placed under the knife, and who had escaped to tell his experiences to Copley Banks. These doings were not unnoticed, nor yet uncommented upon in the town of Kingston. The commandant of the troops, Major Harvey of their artillery, made serious representations to the governor. "She is not a trader, but a small warship," said he. "I think it would be as well to arrest Copley Banks and to seize the vessel." "What do you suspect?" asked the governor, who was a slow-witted man, broken down with fevers and port wine. "I suspect," said the soldier, "that it is Stede Bonnet over again." Now, Stede Bonnet was a planter of high reputation and religious character who, from some sudden and overpowering freshet of wildness in his blood, had given up everything in order to start off pirating in the Caribbean Sea. The example was a recent one, and it had caused the utmost consternation in the islands. Governors had before now been accused of being in league with pirates, and of receiving commissions upon their plunder, so that any want of vigilance was open to a sinister construction. "Well, Major Harvey," said he, I am vastly sorry to do anything which may offend my friend Copley Banks, for many a time have my knees been under his mahogany. But in face of what you say, there is no choice for me but to order you to board the vessel, and to satisfy yourself as to her character and destination." So at 1 in the morning Major Harvey, with a launch full of his soldiers, paid a surprise visit to the Ruffling Harry, with the result that they picked up nothing more solid than a hempen cable floating at the moorings. It had been slipped by the brig, whose owner had scented danger. She had already passed the Palisades, and was beating out against the northeast trades on a course for the Windward Passage. When upon the next morning the brig had left Morant Point a mere haze upon the southern horizon, the men were called aft, and Copley Banks revealed his plans to them. He had chosen them, he said, as brisk boys and lads of spirit, who would rather run some risk upon the sea than starve for a living upon the shore. King's ships were few and weak, and they could master any trader who might come their way. Others had done well at the business, and with a handy, well-found vessel, there was no reason why they should not turn their tarry jackets into velvet coats. If they were prepared to sail under the black flag, he was ready to command them. But if any wished to withdraw, they might have the gig and row back to Jamaica. 4 men out of 60 and 40 asked for their discharge, went over the ship's side into the boat, and rowed away amidst the jeers and howlings of the crew. The rest assembled aft, and drew up the articles of their association. A square of black tarpaulin had the white skull painted upon it, and was hoisted amidst cheering at the main. Officers were elected, and the limits of their authority fixed. Copley Banks was chosen captain, but as there are no mates upon a pirate craft, Birthmark Sweetlocks became quartermaster, and Israel Martin the boatswain. There was no difficulty in knowing what was the custom of the brotherhood, for half the men at least had served upon pirates before. Food should be the same for all, and no man should interfere with another man's drink. The captain should have a cabin, but all hands should be welcome to enter it when they chose. All should share and share alike, save only the captain, quartermaster, boatswain, carpenter, and master gunner, who had from a quarter to a whole share extra. He who saw a prize first should have the best weapon taken out of her. He who boarded her first should have the richest suit of clothes aboard of her. Every man might treat his own prisoner, be it man or woman, after his own fashion. If a man flinched from his gun, the quartermaster should pistol him. These were some of the rules which the crew of the Ruffling Harry subscribed, by putting 42 crosses at the foot of the paper upon which they had been drawn. So a new rover was afloat upon the seas, and her name before a year was over became as well known as that of the Happy Delivery. From the Bahamas to the leewards, and from the leewards to the windwards, Copley Banks became the rival of Sharkey and the terror of traders. For a long time the bark and the brig never met, which was the more singular as the Ruffling Harry was for ever looking in at Sharkey's resorts. But at last one day, when she was passing down the inlet of Coxon's Hole, at the east end of Cuba, with the intention of careening, there was the Happy Delivery, with her blocks and tackle falls already rigged for the same purpose. Copley Banks fired a shot of salute and hoisted the green trumpeter ensign, as the custom was among gentlemen of the sea. Then he dropped his boat and went aboard. Captain Sharkey was not a man of genial mood, nor had he any kindly sympathy for those who were of the same trade as himself. Copley Banks found him seated astride upon one of the after guns, with his New England quartermaster Ned Galloway, and a crowd of roaring ruffians standing about him. Yet none of them roared quite such assurance when Sharkey's pale face and filmy blue eyes were turned upon him. He was in his shirt sleeves, with his cambric frills breaking through his open red satin long-flapped vest. The scorching sun seemed to have no power upon his fleshless frame, for he wore a low fur cap as though it had been winter. A many-coloured band of silk passed across his body and supported a short, murderous sword, while his broad, brass-buckled belt was stuffed with pistols. "Sink you for a poacher!" he cried, as Copley Banks passed over the bulwarks. "I will drub you within an inch of your life, and that inch also. What means you by fishing in my waters?" Copley Banks looked at him, and his eyes were like those of a traveller who sees his home at last. "I am glad that we are of one mind," said he, "for I am myself of opinion that the seas are not large enough for the two of us. But if you will take your sword and pistols and come upon a sandbank with me, then the world will be rid of a damned villain, whichever way it goes." "Now, this is talking," said Sharkey, jumping off the gun and holding out his hand. "I have not met many who could look John Sharkey in the eyes and speak with a full breath. May the devil seize me if I do not choose you as a consort. But if you play me false, then I will come aboard of you and gut you upon your own poop." "And I pledge you the same," said Copley Banks, and so the two pirates became sworn comrades to each other. That summer they went north as far as the Newfoundland Banks, and harried the New York traders and the whale ships from New England. It was Copley Banks who captured the Liverpool ship House of Hanover, but it was Sharkey who fastened her master to the windlass and pelted him to death with empty claret bottles. Together they engaged the King's ship Royal Fortune, which had been sent in search of them, and beat her off after a night action of 5 hours, the drunken, raving crews fighting naked in the light of the battle lanterns, with a bucket of rum and a pannikin laid by the tackles of every gun. They ran to Topsail Inlet in North Carolina to refit, and then in the spring they were at the Grand Caicos, ready for a long cruise down the West Indies. By this time Sharkey and Copley Banks had become very excellent friends, for Sharkey loved a whole-hearted villain, and he loved a man of metal, and it seemed to him that the two met in the captain of the Ruffling Harry. It was long before he gave his confidence to him, for cold suspicion lay deep in his character. Never once would he trust himself outside his own ship and away from his own men. But Copley Banks came often on board the Happy Delivery, and joined Sharkey in many of his morose debauches, so that at last any lingering misgivings of the latter were set at rest. He knew nothing of the evil that he had done to his new boon companion, for of his many victims how could he remember the woman and the 2 boys whom he had slain with such levity so long ago? When, therefore, he received a challenge to himself and to his quartermaster for a carouse upon the last evening of their stay at the Caicos Bank, he saw no reason to refuse. A well-found passenger ship had been rifled the week before, so their fare was of the best, and after supper 5 of them drank deeply together. There were the 2 captains, Birthmark Sweetlocks, Ned Galloway, and Israel Martin, the old buccaneersman. To wait upon them was the dumb steward, whose head Sharkey split with a glass, because he had been too slow in the filling of it. The quartermaster had slipped Sharkey's pistols away from him, for it was an old joke with him to fire them cross-handed under the table and see who was the luckiest man. It was a pleasantry which had cost his boatswain his leg, so now, when the table was cleared, they would coax Sharkey's weapons away from him on the excuse of the heat, and lay them out of his reach. The captain's cabin of the Ruffling Harry was in a deck-house upon the poop, and a stern-chaser gun was mounted at the back of it. Round shot were racked round the wall, and 3 great hogsheads of powder made a stand for dishes and for bottles. In this grim room the 5 pirates sang and roared and drank, while the silent steward still filled up their glasses and passed the box and the candle round for their tobacco pipes. Hour after hour the talk became fouler, the voices hoarser, the curses and shouting more incoherent, until 3 of the 5 had closed their bloodshot eyes and dropped their swimming heads upon the table. Copley Banks and Sharkey were left face to face, the one because he had drunk the least, the other because no amount of liquor would ever shake his iron nerve or warm his sluggish blood. Behind him stood the watchful steward, forever filling up his wandering glass. From without came the low lapping of the tide, and from over the water a sailor's shanty from the bark. In the windless tropical night the words came clearly to their ears. "A trader sailed from Stepney Town. Wake her up, shake her up, try her with the mainsail. A trader sailed from Stepney Town, with a keg full of gold and a velvet gown. Ho, the bully Rover Jack, waiting with his yard aback, out upon the Lowland sea." The 2 boon companions sat listening in silence. Then Copley Banks glanced at the steward, and the man took a coil of rope from the shot rack behind him. "Captain Sharkey," said Copley Banks, "do you remember the Duchess of Cornwall, hailing from London, which you took and sank 3 years ago off the Statteray Shoal?" "Curse me if I can bear their names in mind," said Sharkey. "We did as many as 10 ships a week about that time." "There were a mother and 2 sons among the passengers. Maybe that will bring it back to your mind." Captain Sharkey leant back in thought, with his huge thin beak of a nose jutting upwards. Then he burst suddenly into a high treble neighing laugh. He remembered it, he said, and he added details to prove it. "But burn me if it had not slipped from my mind," he cried. "How came you to think of it?" "It was of interest to me," said Copley Banks, "for the woman was my wife, and the lads were my only sons." Sharkey stared across at his companion, and saw that the smouldering fire which lurked always in his eyes had burned up into a lurid flame. He read their menace, and he clapped his hands to his empty belt. Then he turned to seize a weapon, but the bight of a rope was cast round him, and in an instant his arms were bound to his side. He fought like a wildcat, and screamed for help. "Ned!" he yelled. "Ned! Wake up! Here's damned villainy! Help, Ned! Help!" But the three men were far too deeply sunk in their swinish sleep for any voice to wake them. Round and round went the rope until Sharkey was swathed like a mummy from ankle to neck. They propped him stiff and helpless against a powder barrel, and they gagged him with a handkerchief, but his filmy, red-rimmed eyes still looked curses at them. The dumb man chattered in his exultation, and Sharkey winced for the first time when he saw the empty mouth before him. He understood that vengeance, slow and patient, had dogged him long and clutched him at last. The two captors had their plans all arranged, and they were somewhat elaborate. First of all, they stove the heads of two of the great powder barrels, and they heaped the contents out upon the table and floor. They piled it round and under the three drunken men until each sprawled in a heap of it. Then they carried Sharkey to the gun, and they triced him sitting over the porthole, with his body about a foot from the muzzle. Wriggle as he would, he could not move an inch, either to the right or left, and the dumb man trussed him up with a sailor's cunning, so that there was no chance that he should work free. "Now, you bloody devil," said Copley Banks softly, "you must listen to what I have to say to you, for they are the last words that you will hear. You are my man now, and I have bought you at a price, for I have given all that a man can give here below, and I have given my soul as well. To reach you I have had to sink to your level. For 2 years I strove against it, hoping that some other way might come, but I learnt that there was no other. I've robbed and I have murdered. Worse still, I have laughed and lived with you, and all for the one end. And now my time has come, and you will die as I would have you die, seeing the shadow creeping upon you, and the devil waiting for you in the shadow." Sharkey could hear the hoarse voices of his rovers singing their shanty over the water. "Where is the traitor of Steepney Town? Wake her up, shake her up, ever stick a-bending. Where is the traitor of Steepney Town? His gold's on the capstan, his blood's on his gown. All for bully Rover Jack, reaching on the weather tack, right across the Lowland Sea." The words came clear to his ear, and just outside he could hear two men pacing backwards and forwards upon the deck. And yet he was helpless, staring down the mouth of the 9-pounder, unable to move an inch, or to utter so much as a groan. Again there came the burst of voices from the deck of the barque. "So it's up, and it's over to Stornoway Bay. Pack it on, crack it on, try her with stun sails. It's off on a bowline to Stornoway Bay, where the liquor is good and the lasses are gay, waiting for their bully Jack, watching for him sailing back, right across the Lowland Sea." To the dying pirate, the jovial words and rollicking tune made his own fate seem the harsher, but there was no softening in those venomous blue eyes. Copley Banks had brushed away the priming of the gun, and had sprinkled fresh powder over the touch-hole. Then he had taken up the candle and cut it to length of about an inch. This he placed upon the loose powder at the breech of the gun. Then he scattered powder thickly over the floor beneath, so that when the candle fell at the recoil it must explode the huge pile in which the three drunkards were wallowing. "You've made others look death in the face, Sharkey," said he. "Now it has come to be your own turn. You and these swine here shall go together." He lit the candle end as he spoke, and blew out the other lights upon the table. Then he passed out with the dumb man, and locked the cabin door upon the outer side. But before he closed it he took an exultant look backwards, and received one last curse from those unconquerable eyes. In the single dim circle of light, that ivory-white face, with the gleam of moisture upon the high, bald forehead, was the last that was ever seen of Sharkey. There was a skiff alongside, and in it Copley Banks and the dumb steward made their way to the beach, and looked back upon the brig riding in the moonlight just outside the shadow of the palm trees. They waited and waited, watching that dim light which shone through the stern port. And then at last there came the dull thud of a gun, and an instant later the shattering crash of an explosion. The long, sleek black barque, the sweep of white sand, and the fringe of nodding, feathery palm trees sprang into dazzling light and back into darkness again. Voices screamed and called upon the bay. Then Copley Banks, his heart singing within him, touched his companion on the shoulder, and they plunged together into the lonely jungle of the Caicos. End of Part 3 and Captain Sharkey. Section 5 of the Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Section 5. The Croxley Master. Chapter 1, Part 1. Mr. Robert Montgomery was seated at his desk, his head upon his hands, in a state of the blackest despondency. Before him was the open ledger with the long columns of Dr. Oldacre's prescriptions. At his elbow lay the wooden tray with the labels in various partitions, the cork box, the lumps of twisted sealing wax, while in front a rank of bottles waited to be filled. But his spirits were too low for work. He sat in silence with his fine shoulders bowed and his head upon his hands. Outside, through the grimy surgery window, over a foreground of blackened brick and slate, a line of enormous chimneys, like cyclopean pillars, upheld the lowering, dun-coloured cloud bank. For 6 days in the week they spouted smoke, but today the furnace fires were banked, for it was Sunday. Sordid and polluting gloom hung over a district blighted and blasted by the greed of man. There was nothing in the surroundings to cheer a desponding soul, but it was more than his dismal environment which weighed upon the medical assistant. His trouble was deeper and more personal. The winter session was approaching. He should be back again at the university, completing the last year which would give him his medical degree, but alas, he had not the money with which to pay his class fees, nor could he imagine how he could procure it. £60 were wanted to make his career, and it might have been as many thousand for any chance there seemed to be of his obtaining it. He was roused from his black meditation by the entrance of Dr. Oldacre himself, a large, clean-shaven, respectable man, with a prim manner and an austere face. He had prospered exceedingly by the support of the local church interest, and the rule of his life was never by word or action to run a risk of offending the sentiment which had made him. His standard of respectability and of dignity was exceedingly high, and he expected the same from his assistants. His appearance and words were always vaguely benevolent. A sudden impulse came over the despondent student. He would test the reality of this philanthropy. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Oldacre," said he, rising from his chair. "I have a great favour to ask of you." The doctor's appearance was not encouraging. His mouth suddenly tightened and his eyes fell. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery." "You are aware, sir, that I need only one more session to complete my course." "So you have told me." "It is very important to me, sir." "Naturally." "The fees, Dr. Oldacre, would amount to about £60. "I am afraid that my duties call me elsewhere, Mr. Montgomery." "One moment, sir. I had hoped, sir, that perhaps, if I signed a paper promising you interest upon your money, you would advance the sum to me. I will pay you back, sir, I really will, or, if you like, I will work it off after I am qualified." The doctor's lips had thinned into a narrow line, his eyes were raised again, and sparkled indignantly. "Your request is unreasonable, Mr. Montgomery. I am surprised that you should have made it. Consider, sir, how many thousands of medical students there are in this country. No doubt there are many of them who have a difficulty in finding their fees. Am I to provide for them all? Or why should I make an exception in your favour? I am grieved and disappointed, Mr. Montgomery, that you should have put me into the painful position of having to refuse you." He turned upon his heel and walked with offended dignity out of the surgery. The student smiled bitterly and turned to his work of making up the morning prescriptions. It was poor and unworthy work, work which any weakling might have done as well, and this was a man of exceptional nerve and sinew. But, such as it was, it brought him his board and £1 a week, enough to help him during the summer months and let him save a few pounds towards his winter keep. But those class fees, where were they to come from? He could not save them out of his scanty wage. Dr. Oldacre would not advance them. He saw no way of earning them. His brains were fairly good, but brains of that quality were a drug in the market. He only excelled in his strength, and where was he to find a customer for that? But the ways of fate are strange, and his customer was at hand. "Look here," said a voice at the door. Montgomery looked up, for the voice was a loud and rasping one. A young man stood at the entrance, a stocky, bull-necked young miner, in tweed Sunday clothes and an aggressive necktie. He was a sinister-looking figure, with dark, insolent eyes, and the jaw and throat of a bulldog. "Look here," said he again. "Why hast thou not sent to medicine oop as thy master ordered?" Montgomery had become accustomed to the brutal frankness of the northern worker. At first it had enraged him, but after a time he had grown callous to it and accepted it as it was meant. But this was something different. It was insolence, brutal, overbearing insolence, with physical menace behind it. "What name?" he asked coldly. "Barton. Happen I may give thee cause to mind that name, young man. Make up to wife's medicine this very moment, look ye, or it will be the worse for thee." Montgomery smiled. A pleasant sense of relief thrilled softly through him. What blessed safety valve was this through which his jangled nerves might find some outlet? The provocation was so gross, the insult so unprovoked, that he could have none of those qualms which take the edge off a man's mettle. He finished sealing the bottle upon which he was occupied, and he addressed it and placed it carefully in the rack. "Look here," said he, turning round to the miner. "Your medicine will be made up in its turn and sent down to you. I don't allow folk in the surgery. Wait outside in the waiting room, if you wish to wait at all." "Young man," said the miner, "thou's got to make to wife's medicine here and now and quick, while I wait and watch thee, or else happen thou might need some medicine thyself before all is over." "I shouldn't advise you to fasten a quarrel upon me." Montgomery was speaking in the hard staccato voice of a man who is holding himself in with difficulty. "You'll save trouble if you'll go quietly. If you don't, you'll be hurt." "Ah, you would! Take it, then." The blows were almost simultaneous, a savage swing which whistled past Montgomery's ear, and a straight drive which took the workman on the chin. Luck was with the assistant. That single whizzing uppercut, and the way in which it was delivered, warned him that he had a formidable man to deal with. But if he had underrated his antagonist had also underrated him, and had laid himself open to a fatal blow. The miner's head had come with a crash against the corner of the surgery shelves, and he had dropped heavily onto the ground. There he lay with his bandy legs drawn up and his hands thrown abroad, the blood trickling over the surgery tiles. "Had enough?" asked the assistant, breathing fiercely through his nose. But no answer came. The man was insensible. And then the danger of his position came upon Montgomery, and he turned as white as his antagonist. A Sunday, the immaculate Dr. Oldacre with his pious connection, a savage brawl with a patient. He would irretrievably lose his situation if the facts came out. It was not much of a situation, but he could not get another without a reference, and Oldacre might refuse him one. Without money for his classes, and without a situation, what was to become of him? It was absolute ruin. But perhaps he could escape exposure after all. He seized his insensible adversary, dragged him out into the centre of the room, loosened his collar, and squeezed the surgery sponge over his face. He sat up at last with a gasp and a scowl. "Dominie, thou spoilt my necktie," said he, mopping up the water from his breast. "I'm sorry I hit you so hard," said Montgomery apologetically. "Thou hit me hard? I could stand such fly-flapping all day. 'Twas this here press that cracked my pate for me, and thou art a lucky man to be able to boast as thou hast outed me. And now I'd be obliged to thee if thou wilt give me to wife's medicine." Montgomery gladly made it up and handed it to the miner. "You are weak still," said he. "Won't you stay a while and rest?" "To wife wants some medicine," said the man, and lurched out at the door. The assistant, looking after him, saw him rolling with an uncertain step down the street until a friend met him, and they walked on arm in arm. The man seemed in his rough northern fashion to bear no grudge, and so Montgomery's fears left him. There was no reason why the doctor should know anything about it. He wiped the blood from the floor, put the surgery in order, and went on with his interrupted task, hoping that he had come scatheless out of a very dangerous business. Yet all day he was aware of a sense of vague uneasiness, which sharpened into dismay when, late in the afternoon, he was informed that 3 gentlemen had called and were waiting for him in the surgery. A coroner's inquest, a descent of detectives, an invasion of angry relatives, all sorts of possibilities rose to scare him. With tense nerves and a rigid face, he went to meet his visitors. They were a very singular trio. Each was known to him by sight, but what on earth the 3 could be doing together, and, above all, what they could expect from him, was a most inexplicable problem. The first was Sorley Wilson, the son of the owner of the Nonpareil coal pit. He was a young blood of 20, heir to a fortune, a keen sportsman, and down for the Easter vacation from Magdalene College. He sat now upon the edge of the surgery table, looking in thoughtful silence at Montgomery and twisting the ends of his small black waxed moustache. The second was Purvis, the publican, owner of the chief beer shop, and well known as the local bookmaker. He was a coarse, clean-shaven man, whose fiery face made a singular contrast with his ivory-white bald head. He had shrewd, light-blue eyes with foxy lashes, and he also leaned forward in silence from his chair, a fat red hand upon either knee, and stared critically at the young assistant. So did the third visitor, Fawcett, the horsebreaker, who leaned back, his long, thin legs, with their boxcloth riding gaiters, thrust out in front of him, tapping his protruding teeth with his riding whip, with anxious thought in every line of his rugged, bony face. Publican, exquisite, and horsebreaker were all 3 equally silent, equally earnest, and equally critical. Montgomery, seated in the midst of them, looked from one to the other. "Well, gentlemen?" he observed, but no answer came. The position was embarrassing. "No," said the horsebreaker at last. "No, it's off. It's not." "Stand up, lad. Let's see thee standing." It was the publican who spoke. Montgomery obeyed. He would learn all about it, no doubt, if he were patient. He stood up and turned slowly round, as if in front of his tailor. "It's off! It's off!" cried the horsebreaker. "Why, mon, the master would break him over his knee." "Oh, that he be hanged for a yarn," said the young Cantab. "You can drop out if you like, Fawcett, but I'll see this thing through if I have to do it alone. I don't hedge a penny. I like the cut of him a great deal better than I like Ted Barton." "Look at Barton's shoulders, Mr. Wilson." "Lumpiness isn't always strength. Give me nerve and fire and breed. That's what wins." "Aye, sir, you have it there, you have it there," said the fat red publican, in a thick, suety voice. "It's the same with poops. Get 'em clean bred and fine, and they'll yark the thick 'uns, yark 'em out of their skins." "He's 10 good pund on the light side," growled the horsebreaker. "He's a welterweight, anyhow." 130. 150 if he's an ounce." "Well, the master doesn't scale much more than that." 175. "That was when he was hog fat and living high. Work the grease out of him, and I lay there's no great difference between them. Have you been weighed lately, Mr. Montgomery?" It was the first direct question which had been asked him. He had stood in the midst of them like a horse at a fair, and he was just beginning to wonder whether he was more angry or amused. "I am just 11 stone," said he. "I said that he was a welterweight." "But suppose you was trained," said the publican. "What then?" "I am always in training." "In a manner of speaking, no doubt, he's always in training," remarked the horsebreaker. "But training for everyday work ain't the same as training with a trainer. And I dare bet, with all respect to your opinion, Mr. Wilson, that there's half a stone of tallow on him at this minute." The young Cantab put his fingers on the assistant's upper arm. Then, with his other hand on his wrist, he bent the forearm sharply, and felt the biceps, as round and hard as a cricket ball, spring up under his fingers. "Feel that," said he. The publican and horsebreaker felt it with an air of reverence. "Good lad, he'll do yet," cried Purvis. "Gentlemen," said Montgomery, "I think that you will acknowledge that I have been very patient with you. I have listened to all that you have to say about my personal appearance, and now I must really beg that you will have the goodness to tell me what is the matter." They all sat down in their serious, business-like way. "That's easy done, Mr. Montgomery," said the fat-voiced publican. "But before saying anything, we had to wait and see whether, in a way of speaking, there was any need for us to say anything at all. Mr. Wilson thinks there is. Mr. Fawcett, who has the same right to his opinion, being also a backer and one of the committee, thinks the other way." "I thought him too light-built, and I think so now," said the horsebreaker, still tapping his prominent teeth with the metal head of his riding-whip. "But happen he may pull through, and he's a fine-made, birdly young chap. So if you mean to back him, Mr. Wilson, which I do, and you, Purvis, I ain't one to go back, Fawcett." "Well, I'll stand to my share of the purse." "And well I knew you would," said Purvis, "for it would be something new to find Isaac Fawcett as a spoil sport. Well, then, we will make up the 100 for the stake among us, and the fight stands, always supposing the young man is willing." "Excuse all this rot, Mr. Montgomery," said the university man in a genial voice. "We've begun at the wrong end, I know, but we'll soon straighten it out, and I hope that you will see your way to falling in with our views. In the first place, you remember the man whom you knocked out this morning? He is Barton, the famous Ted Barton." "I'm sure, sir, you may well be proud to have outed him in one round," said the publican. "Why, it took Morris, the 10 stone 6 champion, a deal more trouble than that before he put Barton to sleep. You've done a fine performance, sir, and happen you'll do a finer if you give yourself the chance." "I never heard of Ted Barton, beyond seeing the name on a medicine label," said the assistant. "Well, you may take it from me that he's a slaughterer," said the horsebreaker. "You've taught him a lesson that he needed, for it was always a word and a blow with him, and the word alone was worth 5 shillin' in a public court. He won't be so ready now to shake his knee in the face of every one he meets. However, that's neither here nor there." Montgomery looked at them in bewilderment. "For goodness' sake, gentlemen, tell me what it is you want me to do," he cried. "We want you to fight Silas Craggs, better known as the Master of Croxley." "But why?" "Because Ted Barton was to have fought him next Saturday. He was the champion of the Wilson coal pits, and the other was the master of the iron folk down at the Croxley smelters. We'd matched our man for a purse of 100 against the master. But you've queered our man, and he can't face such a battle with a 2-inch cut at the back of his head. There's only one thing to be done, sir, and that is for you to take his place. If you can lick Ted Barton, you may lick the Master of Croxley, but if you don't, we're done. For there's no one else who is in the same street with him in this district. It's 20 rounds, 2-ounce gloves, Queensberry rules, and a decision on points if you fight to the finish." For a moment the absurdity of the thing drove every other thought out of Montgomery's head. But then there came a sudden revulsion. £100? All he wanted to complete his education was lying there ready to his hand, if only that hand were strong enough to pick it up. He had thought bitterly that morning that there was no market for his strength, but here was one where his muscle might earn him more in an hour than his brains in a year. But a chill of doubt came over him. "How can I fight for the coal pits?" said he. "I'm not connected with them." "Eh, lad, but thou art," cried old Purvis. "We've got it down in writing, and it's clear enough anyone connected with the coal pits. Dr. Oldacre is the coal pit club doctor. Thou art his assistant. What more can they want?" "Yes, that's right enough," said the Cantab. "It would be a very sporting thing of you, Mr. Montgomery, if you would come to our help when we are in such a hole. Of course, you might not like to take the £100, but I have no doubt that in the case of your winning, we could arrange that it should take the form of a watch or a piece of plate, or any other shape which might suggest itself to you. You see, you are responsible for our having lost our champion, so we really feel that we have a claim upon you." "Give me a moment, gentlemen. It is very unexpected. I am afraid the doctor would never consent to my going. In fact, I am sure that he would not." "But he need never know. Not before the fight, at any rate. We are not bound to give the name of our man. So long as he is within the weight limits on the day of the fight, that is all that concerns anyone." The adventure and the profit would either of them have attracted Montgomery. The two combined were irresistible. "Gentlemen," said he, "I'll do it." The three sprang from their seats. The publican had seized his right hand, the horse dealer his left, and the cantab slapped him on the back. "Good lad, good lad," croaked the publican. "Eh, mon, but if thou yark him, thou'll rise in one day from being just a common doctor to the best known mon twixt here and Broadford. Thou art a withering tyke, thou art, and no mistake, and if thou beat the Master of Croxley, thou'll find all the beer thou want for the rest of thy life waiting for thee at the Four Sacks." "It is the most sporting thing I have ever heard of in my life," said young Wilson. "By George, sir, if you pull it off, you've got the constituency in your pocket, if you care to stand. You know the outhouse in my garden?" "Next the road?" "Exactly. I turned it into a gymnasium for Ted Barton. You'll find all you want there, clubs, punching balls, bars, dumbbells, everything. Then you'll want a sparring partner. Ogilvy has been acting for Barton, but we don't think that he is class enough. Barton bears you no grudge. He's a good-hearted fellow, though cross-grained with strangers. He looked upon you as a stranger this morning, but he says he knows you now. He is quite ready to spar with you for practice, and he will come any hour you will name." "Thank you. I will let you know the hour," said Montgomery, and so the committee departed jubilant upon their way. End of Chapter 1, Part 1. Section 6 of the Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Section 6. The Croxley Master. Chapter 1, Part 2. The medical assistant sat for a time in the surgery, turning it over a little in his mind. He had been trained originally at the university by the man who had been middleweight champion in his day. It was true that his teacher was long past his prime, slow upon his feet, and stiff in his joints, but even so he was still a tough antagonist. But Montgomery had found at last that he could more than hold his own with him. He had won the university medal, and his teacher, who had trained so many students, was emphatic in his opinion that he had never had one who was in the same class with him. He had been exhorted to go in for the amateur championships, but he had no particular ambition in that direction. Once he had put on the gloves of Hammer Tunstall in a booth at a fair, and had fought 3 rattling rounds, in which he had had the worst of it, but had made the prize-fighter stretch himself to the uttermost. There was his whole record, and was it enough to encourage him to stand up to the Master of Croxley? He had never heard of the Master before, but then he had lost touch of the ring during the last few years of hard work. After all, what did it matter? If he won, there was the money, which meant so much to him. If he lost, it would only mean a thrashing. He could take the punishment without flinching. Of that he was certain. If there was only one chance in 100 of pulling it off, then it was worth his while to attempt it. Dr. Oldacre, new come from the church, with an ostentatious prayer book in his kid-glove hand, broke in upon his meditation. "You don't go to service, I observe, Mr. Montgomery," said he, coldly. "No, sir. I have had some business to detain me." "It is very near to my heart that my household should set a good example. There are so few educated people in this district that a great responsibility devolves upon us. If we do not live up to the highest, how can we expect these poor workers to do so? It is a dreadful thing to reflect that the parish takes a great deal more interest in an approaching glove fight than in their religious duties." "A glove fight, sir?" said Montgomery, guiltily. "I believe that to be the correct term. One of my patients tells me that it is the talk of the district. A local ruffian, a patient of ours, by the way, matched against a pugilist over at Croxley. I cannot understand why the law does not step in and stop so degrading an exhibition. It is really a prize fight." "A glove fight, you said?" "I am informed that a 2-ounce glove is an evasion by which they dodge the law, and make it difficult for the police to interfere. They contend for a sum of money. It seems dreadful and almost incredible, does it not, to think that such scenes can be enacted within a few miles of our peaceful home? But you will realize, Mr. Montgomery, that while there are such influences for us to counteract, it is very necessary that we should live up to our highest." The doctor's sermon would have had more effect if the assistant had not once or twice had occasion to test his highest, and come upon it at unexpectedly humble elevations. It is always so particularly easy to compound for sins we're most inclined to by damning those we have no mind to. In any case, Montgomery felt that of all the men concerned in such a fight, promoters, backers, spectators, it is the actual fighter who holds the strongest and most honorable position. His conscience gave him no concern upon the subject. Endurance and courage are virtues, not vices, and brutality is, at least, better than effeminacy. There was a little tobacco shop at the corner of the street where Montgomery got his bird's eye and also his local information, for the shopman was a garrulous soul who knew everything about the affairs of the district. The assistant strolled down there after tea and asked, in a casual way, whether the tobacconist had ever heard of the Master of Croxley. "Heard of him? Heard of him?" The little man could hardly articulate in his astonishment. "Why, sir, he's the first man of the district, and his name is well known in the West Riding as the winner of Derby. But law, sir—" Here he stopped and rummaged among a heap of papers. "They are making a fuss about him on account of his fight with Ted Barton, and so the Croxley Herald has his life on record, and here it is, and thou canst read it for thyself." The sheet of the paper which he held up was a lake of print around an islet of illustration. The latter was a coarse woodcut of a pugilist's head and neck set in a cross-barred jersey. It was a sinister but powerful face, the face of a debauched hero, clean-shaven, strongly eyebrowed, keen-eyed, with huge, aggressive jaw, and an animal dewlap beneath it. The long, obstinate cheeks ran flush up to the narrow, sinister eyes. The mighty neck came down square from the ears and curved outwards into shoulders, which had lost nothing at the hands of the local artist. Above was written Silas Craggs, and beneath, the Master of Croxley. "They'll find all about him there, sir," said the tobacconist. "He's a witherin' tyke, he is, and we're proud to have him in the county. If he hadn't broke his leg, he'd have been champion of England." "Broke his leg, has he?" "Yes, and it's set badly. They call him Old K behind his back, for that is how his two legs look. But his arms, well, if they was both stropped to a bench, as the saying is, I wonder where the champion of England would be then." "I'll take this with me," said Montgomery, and putting the paper into his pocket, he returned home. It was not a cheering record which he read there. The whole history of the Croxley Master was given in full, his many victories, his few defeats. "Born in 1857, said the provincial biographer, Silas Craggs, better known in sporting circles as the Master of Croxley, is now in his 40th year." "Hang it, I'm only 23," said Montgomery to himself, and read on more cheerfully. Having in his youth shown a surprising aptitude for the game, he fought his way up among his comrades until he became the recognized champion of the district and won the proud title which he still holds. Ambitious of a more than local fame, he secured a patron and fought his first fight against Jack Barton of Birmingham in May 1880 at the Old Loiterers' Club. Craggs, who fought at 10 stone 2 at the time, had the better of 15 rattling rounds, and gained an award on points against the Midlander. Having disposed of James Dunn, of Rotherhithe, Cameron of Glasgow, and a youth named Fernie, he was thought so highly of by the fancy that he was matched against Ernest Willox, at that time middleweight champion of the north of England, and defeated him in a hard-fought battle, knocking him out in the 10th round after a punishing contest. At this period it looked as if the very highest honours of the ring were within the reach of the young Yorkshireman, but he was laid upon the shelf by a most unfortunate accident. The kick of a horse broke his thigh, and for a year he was compelled to rest himself. When he returned to his work, the fracture had set badly, and his activity was much impaired. It was owing to this that he was defeated in several rounds by Willox, the man whom he had previously beaten, and afterwards by James Shaw of London, though the latter acknowledged that he had fought the toughest customer of his career. Undismayed by his reverses, the Master adapted the style of his fighting to his physical disabilities and resumed his career of victory, defeating Norton, the Black, Hobby Wilson, and Levi Cohen, the latter a heavyweight. Conceding 2 stone, he fought a draw with the famous Billy McQuire, and afterwards, for a purse of £50, he defeated Sam Hare at the Pelican Club, London. In 1891, a decision was given against him upon a foul when fighting a winning fight against Jim Taylor, the Australian middleweight, and so mortified was he by the decision that he withdrew from the ring. Since then he has hardly fought at all save to accommodate any local aspirant who may wish to learn the difference between a bar-room scramble and a scientific contest. The latest of these ambitious souls comes from the Wilson coal pits, which have undertaken to put up a stake of £100 and back their local champion. There are various rumours afloat as to who their representative is to be, the name of Ted Barton being freely mentioned. But the betting, which is 7-1 on the Master against any untried man, is a fair reflection of the feeling of the community. Montgomery read it over twice, and it left him with a very serious face. No light matter this which he had undertaken, no battle with a rough-and-tumble fighter who presumed upon a local reputation. The man's record showed that he was first class, or nearly so. There were a few points in his favour, and he must make the most of them. There was age, 23 against 40. There was an old ring proverb that youth will be served, but the annals of the ring offer a great number of exceptions. A hard veteran full of cool valour and ring-craft could give 10 or 15 years and a beating to most striplings. He could not rely too much upon his advantage in age. But then there was the lameness. That must surely count for a great deal. And lastly, there was the chance that the Master might underrate his opponent, that he might be remiss in his training and refuse to abandon his usual way of life, if he thought that he had an easy task before him. In a man of his age and habits this seemed very possible. Montgomery prayed that it might be so. Meanwhile, if his opponent were the best man who ever jumped the ropes into a ring, his own duty was clear. He must prepare himself carefully, throw away no chance, and do the very best that he could. But he knew enough to appreciate the difference which exists in boxing, as in every sport, between the amateur and the professional. The coolness, the power of hitting, above all the capability of taking punishment, count for so much. Those specially developed gutta-percha-like abdominal muscles of the hardened pugilist will take without flinching a blow which would leave another man writhing on the ground. Such things are not to be acquired in a week, but all that could be done in a week should be done. The medical assistant had a good basis to start from. He was 5'11", tall enough for anything on two legs, as the old ring men used to say, lithe and spare, with the activity of a panther, and a strength which had hardly yet ever found its limitations. His muscular development was finely hard, but his power came rather from that higher nerve energy which counts for nothing upon a measuring tape. He had the well-curved nose and the widely opened eye, which never yet were seen upon the face of a craven, and behind everything he had the driving force, which came from the knowledge that his whole career was at stake upon the contest. The three backers rubbed their hands when they saw him at work punching the ball in the gymnasium next morning, and Fawcett, the horsebreaker, who had written to Leeds to hedge his bets, sent a wire to cancel the letter and to lay another 50 at the market price of 7-1. Montgomery's chief difficulty was to find time for his training without any interference from the doctor. His work took him a large part of the day, but as the visiting was done on foot, and considerable distances had to be traversed, it was a training in itself. For the rest, he punched the swinging ball and worked with the dumbbells for an hour every morning and evening, and boxed twice a day with Ted Barton in the gymnasium, gaining as much profit as could be got from a rushing two-handed slogger. Barton was full of admiration for his cleverness and quickness, but doubtful about his strength. Hard hitting was the feature of his own style, and he exacted it from others. "Lord, sir, that's a terrible poor punch for an 11-stone man," he would cry. "Thou wilt have to hit harder than that afore t' master will know that thou art there. Oh, that's better, mon, that's fine," he would add, as his opponent lifted him across the room on the end of a right counter. "That's how I likes to feel him. Happen thou'll pull through yet." He chuckled with joy when Montgomery knocked him into a corner. Man, thou art coming along grand. Thou hast fair yarked me off my legs. Do it again, lad. Do it again." The only part of Montgomery's training which came within the doctor's observation was his diet, and that puzzled him considerably. You will excuse my remarking, Mr. Montgomery, that you are becoming rather particular in your tastes. Such fads are not to be encouraged in one's youth. Why do you eat toast with every meal?" "I find that it suits me better than bread, sir." "It entails unnecessary work upon the cook. I observe also that you have turned against potatoes." "Yes, sir, I think that I am better without them." "And you no longer drink your beer?" "No, sir." "These causeless whims and fancies are very much to be deprecated, Mr. Montgomery. Consider how many there are to whom these very potatoes and this very beer would be most acceptable." "No doubt, sir, but at present I prefer to do without them." They were sitting alone at lunch, and the assistant thought that it would be a good opportunity of asking leave for the day of the fight. "I should be glad if you could let me have leave for Saturday, Dr. Oldacre." "It is very inconvenient upon so busy a day." "I should do a double day's work on Friday, so as to leave everything in order. I should hope to be back in the evening." "I'm afraid I cannot spare you, Mr. Montgomery." This was a facer. If he could not get leave, he would go without it. "You will remember, Dr. Oldacre, that when I came to you it was understood that I should have a clear day every month. I have never claimed one, but now there are reasons why I wish to have a holiday upon Saturday." Dr. Oldacre gave in with a very bad grace. "Of course, if you insist upon your formal rights, there is no more to be said, Mr. Montgomery, though I feel that it shows a certain indifference to my comfort and the welfare of the practice. Do you still insist?" "Yes, sir." "Very good. Have your way." The doctor was boiling over with anger, but Montgomery was a valuable assistant, steady, capable, and hard-working, and he could not afford to lose him. Even if he had been prompted to advance those class fees, for which his assistant had appealed, it would have been against his interest to do so, for he did not wish him to qualify, and he desired him to remain in his subordinate position, in which he worked so hard for so small a wage. There was something in the cool insistence of the young man, a quiet resolution in his voice as he claimed his Saturday, which aroused his curiosity. "I have no desire to interfere unduly with your affairs, Mr. Montgomery, but were you thinking of having a day in Leeds upon Saturday?" "No, sir." "In the country?" "Yes, sir." "You are very wise. You will find a quiet day among the wild flowers a very valuable restorative. Have you thought about any particular direction?" "I am going over Croxley Way." "Well, there is no prettier country when once you are past the ironworks. What could be more delightful than to lie upon the fells, basking in the sunshine, with perhaps some instructive and elevating book as your companion? I should recommend a visit to the ruins of St. Bridget's Church, a very interesting relic of the early Norman era. By the way, there is one objection which I see to your going to Croxley on Saturday. It is upon that date, as I am informed, that the ruffianly glove fight takes place. You may find yourself molested by the blackguards whom it will attract." "I will take my chance of that, sir," said the assistant. On the Friday night, which was the last night before the fight, Montgomery's three backers assembled in the gymnasium and inspected their man as he went through some light exercises to keep his muscles supple. He was certainly in splendid condition, his skin shining with health and his eyes with energy and confidence. The three walked round him and exulted. "He's simply ripping," said the undergraduate. "By gad, you've come out splendidly. You're as hard as a pebble and fit to fight for your life." "Happen he's a trifle on the fine side," said the publican. "Runs a bit light at the loins, to my way of thinking." "What weight to-day?" 10 stone 11, the assistant answered. "That's only 3 pound off in a week's training," said the horsebreaker. "He said right when he said that he was in condition. Well, it's fine stuff, all there is of it, but I'm none so sure as there is enough." He kept poking his finger into Montgomery as if he were one of his horses. "I hear that the master will scale 160 odd at the ringside." "But there's some of that which he'd like well to put off and leave behind with his shirt," said Purvis. "I hear they've had a rare job to get him to drop his beer, and if it had not been for that great red-headed wench of his, they'd never ha' done it. She fair scratted the face off a potman that had brought him a gallon from to Chequers. They say the hussy is his sparrin' partner, as well as his sweetheart, and that his poor wife is just breaking her heart over it." "Hullo, young 'un, what do you want?" The door of the gymnasium had opened, and a lad, about 16, grimy and black with soot and iron, stepped into the yellow glare of the oil lamp. Ted Barton seized him by the collar. "See here, thou young whelp, this is private, and we want none of thy spying." "But I maun speak to Mr. Wilson." The young Cantab stepped forward. "Well, my lad, what is it?" "It's about to fight, Mr. Wilson, sir. I wanted to tell your mon something aboot the Master." "We've no time to listen to gossip, my boy. We know all about the Master." "But thou don't, sir. Nobody knows but me and mother, and we thought as we'd like thy mon to know, sir, for we want him to fair bray him." "Oh, you want the Master fair bray, do you? So do we. Well, what have you to say?" "Is this your mon, sir?" "Well, suppose it is." "Then it's him I want to tell about it. T' Master is blind in the left eye." "Nonsense!" "It's true, sir. Not stone blind, but rarely fogged. He keeps it secret, but mother knows, and so do I. If thou slip him on the left side, he can't cop thee. Thou'll find it right as I tell thee. And mark him when he thinks it's right. 'Tis his best blow, his right upper cut. T' Maister's finisher, they ca' it at the works. It's a turrible blow when it do come home." "Thank you, my boy. This is information worth having about his sight," said Wilson. "How came you to know so much? Who are you?" "I'm his son, sir." Wilson whistled. "And who sent you to us?" "My mother. I maun get back to her again." "Take this half-crown." "No, sir, I don't seek money in common here. I do it—" "For love?" suggested the publican. "For hate," said the boy, and darted off into the darkness. "Seems to me the red-headed wench may do him more harm than good after all," remarked the publican. "And now, Mr. Montgomery, sir, you've done enough for this evening, and a 9 hours' sleep is the best training before a battle. Happen this time to-morrow night you'll be safe back again with your £100 in your pocket." End of chapter 1. Section 7 of the Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Section 7. The Croxley Master. Chapter 2. Work was struck at 1 o'clock at the coal pits and the ironworks, and the fight was arranged for 3. From the Croxley furnaces, from Wilson's coal pits, from the Heartsease mine, from the Dodd mills, from the Leavenworth smelters, the workmen came trooping, each with his fox terrier or his lurcher at his heels. Warped with labour and twisted by toil, bent double by week-long work in the cramped coal galleries, or half blinded with years spent in front of white-hot fluid metal, these men still gilded their harsh and hopeless lives by their devotion to sport. It was their one relief, the only thing which could distract their minds from sordid surroundings and give them an interest beyond the blackened circle which enclosed them. Literature, art, science, all these things were beyond their horizon, but the race, the football match, the cricket, the fight, these were things which they could understand, which they could speculate upon in advance and comment upon afterwards. Sometimes brutal, sometimes grotesque, the love of sport is still one of the great agencies which make for the happiness of our people. It lies very deeply in the springs of our nature, and when it has been educated out, a higher, more refined nature may be left, but it will not be of that robust British type which has left its mark so deeply on the world. Every one of these rattled workers, slouching with his dog at his heels to see something of the fight, was a true unit of his race. It was a squally May day, with bright sunbursts and driving showers. Montgomery worked all morning in the surgery getting his medicine made up. "The weather seems so very unsettled, Mr. Montgomery," remarked the doctor, "that I am inclined to think that you had better postpone your little country excursion until a later date." "I am afraid that I must go to-day, sir." "I have just had an intimation that Mrs. Potter, at the other side of Angleton, wishes to see me. It is probable that I shall be there all day. It will be extremely inconvenient to leave the house empty so long." "I am very sorry, sir, but I must go," said the assistant doggedly. The doctor saw that it would be useless to argue, and departed in the worst of bad tempers upon mission. Montgomery felt easier now that he was gone. He went up to his room and packed his running shoes, his fighting drawers, and his cricket sash into a handbag. When he came down, Mr. Wilson was waiting for him in the surgery. "I hear the doctor has gone." "Yes, he is likely to be away all day." "I don't see that it matters much. It's bound to come to his ears by tonight." "Yes, it's serious with me, Mr. Wilson. If I win, it's all right. I don't mind telling you that the £100 will make all the difference to me. But if I lose, I shall lose my situation, for, as you say, I can't keep it secret." "Never mind. We'll see you through among us. I only wonder the doctor has not heard, for it's all over the country that you are to fight the Croxley champion. We've had Armitage up about it already. He's the Master's backer, you know. He wasn't sure that you were eligible. The Master said he wanted you whether you were eligible or not. Armitage has money on, and would have made trouble if he could. But I showed him that you came within the conditions of the challenge, and he agreed that it was all right. They think they have a soft thing on." "Well, I can only do my best," said Montgomery. They lunched together, a silent and rather nervous repast, for Montgomery's mind was full of what was before him, and Wilson had himself more money at stake than he cared to lose. Wilson's carriage and a pair were at the door, the horses with blue and white rosettes at their ears, which were the colours of the Wilson coal pits, well known on many a football field. At the avenue gate a crowd of some 100 pitmen and their wives gave a cheer as the carriage passed. To the assistant it all seemed dreamlike and extraordinary, the strangest experience of his life, but with a thrill of human action and interest in it which made it passionately absorbing. He lay back in the open carriage and saw the fluttering handkerchiefs from the doors and windows of the miners' cottages. Wilson had pinned a blue and white rosette upon his coat, and everybody knew him as their champion. "Good luck, sir! Good luck to thee!" they shouted from the roadside. He felt that it was like some unromantic knight riding down to sordid lists, but there was something of chivalry in it all the same. He fought for others as well as for himself. He might fail from want of skill or strength, but deep in his sombre soul he vowed that it should never be for want of heart. Mr. Fawcett was just mounting into his high-wheeled, spidery dog-cart with his little bit of blood between the shafts. He waved his whip and fell in behind the carriage. They overtook Purvis, the tomato-faced publican, upon the road, with his wife in her Sunday bonnet. They also dropped into the procession, and then, as they traversed the 7 miles of the high road to Croxley, their 2-horse, rosetted carriage became gradually the nucleus of a comet with a loosely radiating tail. From every side road came the miners' carts, the humble, ramshackle traps, black and bulging, with their loads of noisy, foul-tongued, open-hearted partisans. They trailed for a long quarter of a mile behind them, cracking, whipping, shouting, galloping, swearing. Horsemen and runners were mixed with the vehicles, and then suddenly a squad of the Sheffield yeomanry, who were having their annual training in those parts, clattered and jingled out of a field and rode as an escort to the carriage. Through the dust clouds round him Montgomery saw the gleaming brass helmets, the bright coats, and the tossing heads of the chargers, the delighted brown faces of the troopers. It was more dreamlike than ever. And then, as they approached the monstrous, uncouth line of bottle-shaped buildings which marked the smelting works of Croxley, their long, writhing snake of dust was headed off by another but longer one which wound across their path. The main road into which their own opened was filled by the rushing current of traps. The Wilson contingent halted until the others should get past. The iron men cheered and groaned, according to their humour, as they whirled past their antagonist. Rough chaff flew back and forwards, like iron nuts and splinters of coal. "Brought him up, then? Got to Hursford to fetch him back? Where's t' old K-legs? Mon, have thy photograph took, 'twill mind thee of what thou used to look. He fight? He's nowt but a half-baked doctor. Happen he'll doctor thy Croxley champion afore he's through it." So they flashed at each other as the one side waited and the other passed. Then there came a rolling murmur, swelling into a shout, and a great brake with 4 horses came clattering along, all streaming with salmon-pink ribbons. The driver wore a white hat with pink rosette, and beside him, on the high seat, were a man and a woman, she with her arm round his waist. Montgomery had one glimpse of them as they flashed past. He with a furry cap drawn low over his brow, a great frieze coat, and a pink comforter round his throat. She, brazen, red-headed, bright-coloured, laughing excitedly. The master, for it was he, turned as he passed, gazed hard at Montgomery, and gave him a menacing, gap-toothed grin. It was a hard, wicked face, blue-jowled and craggy, with long, obstinate cheeks and inexorable eyes. The brake behind was full of patrons of the sport, flushed iron foremen, heads of departments, managers. One was drinking from a metal flask, and raised it to Montgomery as he passed, and then the crowd thinned, and the Wilson cortege with their dragoons swept in at the rear of the others. The road led away from Croxley, between curving green hills, gashed and polluted by the searchers for coal and iron. The whole country had been gutted, and vast piles of refuse and mountains of slag suggested the mighty chambers which the labour of man had burrowed beneath. On the left, the road curved up to where a huge building, roofless and dismantled, stood crumbling and forlorn, with the light shining through the windowless squares. "That's the old Aerosmith's factory. That's where the fight is to be," said Wilson. "How are you feeling now?" "Thank you. I was never better in my life," Montgomery answered. "By Gad, I like your nerve," said Wilson, who was himself flushed and uneasy. "You'll give us a fight for our money, come what may. That place on the right is the office, and that has been set aside as the dressing and weighing room." The carriage drove up to it amidst the shouts of the folk upon the hillside. Lines of empty carriages and traps curved down upon the winding road, and a black crowd surged round the door of the ruined factory. The seats, as a huge placard announced, were 5 shillings, 3 shillings, and a shilling, with half price for dogs. The takings, deducting expenses, were to go to the winner, and it was already evident that a larger stake than £100 was in question. A babel of voices rose from the door. The workers wished to bring their dogs in free. The men scuffled. The dogs barked. The crowd was a whirling, eddying pool, surging with a roar up to the narrow cleft which was its only outlet. The brake, with its salmon-coloured streamers and 4 reeking horses, stood empty before the door of the office. Wilson, Purvis, Fawcett, and Montgomery passed in. There was a large bare room inside with square, clean patches upon the grimy walls, where pictures and almanacs had once hung. Worn linoleum covered the floor, but there was no furniture save some benches and a deal table with an ewer and a basin upon it. 2 of the corners were curtained off. In the middle of the room was a weighing chair. A hugely fat man, with a salmon tie and a blue waistcoat with bird's-eye spots, came bustling up to them. It was Armitage, the butcher and grazier, well known for miles round as a warm man, and the most liberal patron of sport in the riding. "Well, well," he grunted, in a thick, fussy, wheezy voice. "You have come, then. Got your man? Got your man?" "Here he is, fit and well. Mr. Montgomery, let me present you to Mr. Armitage." "Glad to meet you, sir. Happy to make your acquaintance. I make bold to say, sir, that we of Croxley admire your courage, Mr. Montgomery, and that our only hope is a fair fight and no favour, and the best man win. That's our sentiments at Croxley." "And it's my sentiment also," said the assistant. "Well, you can't say fairer than that, Mr. Montgomery. You've taken a large contract in hand, but a large contract may be carried through, sir, as anyone that knows my dealings could testify. The master is ready to weigh in." "So am I." "You must weigh in the buff." Montgomery looked askance at the tall, red-headed woman who was standing gazing out of the window. "That's all right," said Wilson. "Get behind the curtain and put on your fighting kit." He did so, and came out the picture of an athlete, in white loose drawers, canvas shoes, and the sash of a well-known cricket club round his waist. He was trained to a hair, his skin gleaming like silk, and every muscle rippling down his broad shoulders and along his beautiful arms as he moved them. They bunched into ivory knobs, or slid into long, sinuous curves as he raised or lowered his hands. "What thinkest thou of that?" asked Ted Barton, his second, of the woman in the window. She glanced contemptuously at the young athlete. It's but a poor kindness thou dost him to put a thread-paper young gentleman like yon against a mon as is a mon. Why, my Jock would throttle him with one bond lashed behind him." "Happen he may, happen not," said Barton. "I have but £12 in the world, but it's on him, every penny, and no hedging. But here's t' master, and really fine he do look." The prize fighter had come out from his curtain, a squat, formidable figure, monstrous in chest and arms, limping slightly on his distorted leg. His skin had none of the freshness and clearness of Montgomery's, but was dusky and mottled, with one huge mole amid the mat of tangled black hair which thatched his mighty breast. His weight bore no relation to his strength, for those huge shoulders and great arms, with brown, sledge-hammer fists, would have fitted the heaviest man that ever threw his cap into a ring. But his loins and legs were slight in proportion. Montgomery, on the other hand, was as symmetrical as a Greek statue. It would be an encounter between a man who was specially fitted for one sport and one who was equally capable of any. The two looked curiously at each other. A bulldog and a high-bred, clean-limbed terrier, each full of spirit. "How do you do?" "How do?" The master grinned again, and his 3 jagged front teeth gleamed for an instant. The rest had been beaten out of him in 20 years of battle. He spat upon the floor. "We have a rare fine day for't." "Capital," said Montgomery. "That's a good feelin' I like," wheezed the fat butcher. "Good lads, both of them. Prime lads. Hard meat and good bone. There's no ill feelin'." "If he downs me, God bless him," said the master. "And if we down him, God help him," interrupted the woman. "Hold thy tongue, wench," said the master impatiently. "Who art thou to put in thy word? Happen I might draw my hand across thy face." The woman did not take the threat amiss. "Wilt have enough with thy hand to do, Jock," said she. "Get quit of this gradely man afore thou turn on me." The lovers' quarrel was interrupted by the entrance of a newcomer, a gentleman with a fur-collared overcoat and a very shiny top-hat, a top-hat of a degree of glossiness which is seldom seen 5 miles from Hyde Park. This hat he wore at the extreme back of his head, so that the lower surface of the brim made a kind of frame for his high, bald forehead, his keen eyes, his rugged and yet kindly face. He bustled in with a quiet air of possession with which the ringmaster enters the circus. "It's Mr. Stapleton, the referee from London," said Wilson. "How do you do, Mr. Stapleton? I was introduced to you at the big fight at the Corinthian Club in Piccadilly." "Ah, I dare say," said the other, shaking hands. "Fact is, I'm introduced to so many that I can't undertake to carry their names. Wilson, is it? Well, Mr. Wilson, glad to see you. Couldn't get a fly at the station, and that's why I'm late." "I'm sure, sir," said Armitage, "we should be proud that anyone so well known in the boxing world should come down to our little exhibition." "Not at all, not at all. Anything in the interests of boxing. All ready, men? Men weighed?" "Weighing now, sir." "Ah, just as well that I should see it done. Seen you before, Craggs. Saw you fight your second battle against Willox. You had beaten him once, but he came back on you. What does the indicator say? 163 pounds. 2 off for the kit. 161 pounds. Now, my lad, you jump. My goodness, what colours are you wearing?" "The Anonymy Cricket Club." "What right have you to wear them? I belong to the club myself." "So do I." "You an amateur?" "Yes, sir." "And you are fighting for a money prize?" "Yes." "I suppose you know what you are doing. You realise that you're a professional pug from this onwards, and that if ever you fight again, I'll never fight again." "Happen you won't," said the woman, and the master turned a terrible eye upon her. "Well, I suppose you know your own business best. Up you jump. 151 minus 2, 149. 12 pounds difference, but youth and condition on the other scale. Well, the sooner we get to work the better, for I wish to catch the 7 o'clock express at Harefield. 20 3-minute rounds with 1-minute intervals and Queensberry rules. Those are the conditions, are they not?" "Yes, sir." "Very good, then. We may go across." The two combatants had overcoats thrown over their shoulders, and the whole party, backers, fighters, seconds, and the referee, filed out of the room. A police inspector was waiting for them in the road. He had a notebook in his hand, that terrible weapon which awes even the London cabman. "I must take your names, gentlemen, in case it should be necessary to proceed for breach of peace." "You don't mean to stop the fight?" cried Armitage in a passion of indignation. "I'm Mr. Armitage of Croxley, and this is Mr. Wilson, and we'll be responsible that all is fair and as it should be." "I'll take the names in case it should be necessary to proceed," said the inspector impassively. "But you know me well." "If you was a doc or even a judge it would be all the same," said the inspector. "It's the law, and there's an end. I'll not take upon myself to stop the fight, seeing that gloves are to be used, but I'll take the names of all concerned. Silas Craggs, Robert Montgomery, Edward Barton, James Stapleton of London. Who seconds Silas Craggs?" "I do," said the woman. "Yes, you can stare, but it's my job and no one else's. Anastasia's the name. 4 A's. "Craggs?" "Johnson. Anastasia Johnson. If you jug him, you can jug me." "Who talked of jugging, ye fool?" growled the master. "Come on, Mr. Armitage, for I'm fair sick of this loiterin'." The inspector fell in with the procession and proceeded, as they walked up the hill, to bargain in his official capacity for a front seat, where he could safeguard the interests of the law, and in his private capacity to lay out 30 shillings at 7 to 1 with Mr. Armitage. Through the door they passed, down a narrow lane walled with a dense bank of humanity, up a wooden ladder to a platform, over a rope which was slung waist-high from 4 corner stakes. And then Montgomery realized that he was in that ring in which his immediate destiny was to be worked out. On the stake at one corner there hung a blue and white streamer. Barton led him across, the overcoat dangling loosely from his shoulders, and he sat down on a wooden stool. Barton and another man, both wearing white sweaters, stood beside him. The so-called ring was a square, 20 feet each way. At the opposite angle was the sinister figure of the master, with his red-headed woman and a rough-faced friend to look after him. At each corner were metal basins, pitchers of water, and sponges. During the hubbub and uproar of the entrance, Montgomery was too bewildered to take things in. But now there was a few minutes' delay, for the referee had lingered behind, and so he looked quietly about him. It was a sight to haunt him for a lifetime. Wooden seats had been built in, sloping upwards to the tops of the walls. Above, instead of a ceiling, a great flight of crows passed slowly across a square of grey cloud. Right up to the topmost benches the folk were banked, broadcloth in front, corduroys and fustian behind. Faces turned everywhere upon him. The grey reek of the pipes filled the building, and the air was pungent with the acrid smell of cheap, strong tobacco. Everywhere among the human faces were to be seen the heads of the dogs. They growled and yapped from the back benches. In that dense mass of humanity one could hardly pick out individuals. But Montgomery's eyes caught the brazen gleam of the helmets held upon the knees of the 10 yeomen of his escort. At the very edge of the platform sat the reporters, 5 of them, 3 locals and 2 all the way from London. But where was the all-important referee? There was no sign of him, unless he were in the centre of that angry swirl of men near the door. Mr. Stapleton had stopped to examine the gloves which were to be used, and entered the building after the combatants. He had started to come down that narrow lane with the human walls which led to the ring, but already it had gone abroad that the Wilson champion was a gentleman, and that another gentleman had been appointed as referee. A wave of suspicion passed through the Croxley folk. They would have one of their own people for a referee. They would not have a stranger. His path was stopped as he made for the ring. Excited men flung themselves in front of him. They waved their fists in his face and cursed him. A woman howled vile names in his ear. Somebody struck at him with an umbrella. "Go thou back to London. We want none of thee. Go thou back," they yelled. Stapleton, with his shiny hat cocked backwards, and his large bulging forehead swelling from under it, looked round him from beneath his bushy brows. He was in the centre of a savage and dangerous mob. Then he drew his watch from his pocket and held it dial upwards in his palm. "In 3 minutes," said he, "I will declare the fight off." They raged round him. His cool face and that aggressive top hat irritated them. Grimy hands were raised, but it was difficult somehow to strike a man who was so absolutely indifferent. "In 2 minutes I declare the fight off." They exploded into blasphemy. The breath of angry men smoked into his placid face. A gnarled, grimy fist vibrated at the end of his nose. "We tell thee we want none of thee. Get thou back where thou comest from." "In 1 minute I declare the fight off." Then the calm persistence of the man conquered the swaying, mutable, passionate crowd. "Let him through, mon. Happen there'll be no fight after all. Let him through." "Bill, thou lump, let him pass. Dost want the fight declared off?" "Make room for the referee. Room for the Lunan referee." And half pushed, half carried, he was swept up to the ring. There were 2 chairs by the side of it, one for him and one for the timekeeper. He sat down, his hands on his knees, his hat at a more wonderful angle than ever, impassive but solemn, with the aspect of one who appreciates his responsibilities. Mr. Armitage, the portly butcher, made his way into the ring and held up 2 fat hands, sparkling with rings, as a signal for silence. "Gentlemen!" he yelled, and then in a crescendo shriek, "Gentlemen!" "And ladies!" cried somebody, for indeed there was a fair sprinkling of women among the crowd. "Speak up, old man!" shouted another. "What price pork chops?" cried somebody at the back. Everybody laughed, and the dogs began to bark. Armitage waved his hands amidst the uproar as if he were conducting an orchestra. At last the babel thinned into silence. "Gentlemen!" he yelled, "the match is between Silas Craggs, whom we call the Master of Croxley, and Robert Montgomery of the Wilson Coal Pits. The match was to be under 11-8. When they were weighed just now, Craggs weighed 11-7 and Montgomery 10-9. The conditions of the contest are the best of 20 3-minute rounds with 2-ounce gloves. Should the fight run to its full length, it will, of course, be decided upon points. Mr. Stapleton, the well-known London referee, has kindly consented to see fair play. I wish to say that Mr. Wilson and I, the chief backers of the 2 men, have every confidence in Mr. Stapleton, and that we beg that you will accept his rulings without dispute." He then turned from one combatant to the other with a wave of his hand. End of chapter 2. Section 8 of The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Owens. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Section 8. The Croxley Master. Chapter 3. "Montgomery Craggs!" said he. A great hush fell over the huge assembly. Even the dogs stopped yapping. One might have thought that the monstrous room was empty. The 2 men had stood up, the small white gloves over their hands. They advanced from their corners and shook hands, Montgomery gravely, Craggs with a smile. Then they fell into position. The crowd gave a long sigh, the intake of 1,000 excited breaths. The referee tilted his chair onto its back legs and looked moodily critical from one to the other. It was strength against activity. That was evident from the first. The master stood stolidly upon his K-leg. It gave him a tremendous pedestal. One could hardly imagine his being knocked down. And he could pivot round upon it with extraordinary quickness. But his advance or retreat was ungainly. His frame, however, was so much larger and broader than that of the student, and his brown, massive face looked so resolute and menacing, that the hearts of the Wilson party sank within them. There was one heart, however, which had not done so. It was that of Robert Montgomery. Any nervousness which he may have had completely passed away now that he had his work before him. Here was something definite. This hard-faced, deformed Hercules to beat, with a career as the price of beating him. He glowed with the joy of action. It thrilled through his nerves. He faced his man with little in-and-out steps, breaking to the left, breaking to the right, feeling his way, while Craggs, with a dull, malignant eye, pivoted slowly upon his weak leg, his left arm half extended, his right sunk low across the mark. Montgomery led with his left, and then led again, getting lightly home each time. He tried again, but the master had his counter ready, and Montgomery reeled back from a harder blow than he had given. Anastasia, the woman, gave a shrill cry of encouragement, and her man let fly his right. Montgomery ducked under it, and in an instant the two were in each other's arms. "Break away! Break away!" said the referee. The master struck upwards on the break and shook Montgomery with the blow. Then it was time. It had been a spirited opening round. The people buzzed into comment and applause. Montgomery was quite fresh, but the hairy chest of the master was rising and falling. The man passed a sponge over his head while Anastasia flapped the towel before him. "Good lass! Good lass!" cried the crowd, and cheered her. The men were up again, the master grimly watchful, Montgomery as alert as a kitten. The master tried a sudden rush, squattering along with his awkward gait, but coming faster than one would think. The student slipped aside and avoided him. The master stopped, grinned, and shook his head. Then he motioned with his hand as an invitation to Montgomery to come to him. The student did so, and led with his left, but got a swinging right counter in the ribs in exchange. The heavy blow staggered him, and the master came scrambling in to complete his advantage, but Montgomery, with his greater activity, kept out of danger until the call of time. A tame round, and the advantage with the master. "T' maister's too strong for him," said the smelter to his neighbour. "Ay, but the other's a likely lad. Happen we'll see some sport yet. He can jump rarely." "But t' master can stop and hit rarely. Happen he'll make him jump when he gets his knife upon him." They were up again, the water glistening upon their faces. Montgomery led instantly, and got his right home with a sounding smack upon the master's forehead. There was a shout from the colliers, and "Silence! Order!" from the referee. Montgomery avoided the counter and scored with his left. Fresh applause, and the referee upon his feet in indignation. "No comments, gentlemen, if you please, during the rounds." "Just bite a bit," growled the master. "Don't talk. Fight," said the referee angrily. Montgomery rubbed in the point by a flush hit upon the mouth, and the master shambled back to his corner like an angry bear, having had all the worst of the round. "Where's that 7-1?" shouted Purvis the publican. "I'll take 6-1." There were no answers. 5-1. There were givers at that. Purvis booked them in a tattered notebook. Montgomery began to feel happy. He lay back with his legs outstretched, his back against the corner post, and one gloved hand upon each rope. What a delicious minute it was between each round! If he could only keep out of harm's way, he must surely wear this man out before the end of 20 rounds. He was so slow that all his strength went for nothing. "You're fighting a winning fight! A winning fight!" Ted Barton whispered in his ear. "Go, Canny. Take no chances. You have him proper." But the master was crafty. He had fought so many battles with his maimed limb that he knew how to make the best of it. Warily and slowly he manoeuvred round Montgomery, stepping forward and yet again forward, until he had imperceptibly backed him into his corner. The student suddenly saw a flash of triumph upon the grim face, and a gleam in the dull, malignant eyes. The master was upon him. He sprang aside and was on the ropes. The master smashed in one of his terrible uppercuts, and Montgomery half broke it with his guard. The student sprang the other way and was against the other converging rope. He was trapped in the angle. The master sent in another with a hoggish grunt which spoke of the energy behind it. Montgomery ducked, but got a jab from the left upon the mark. He closed with his man. "Break away! Break away!" cried the referee. Montgomery disengaged and got a swinging blow on the ear as he did so. It had been a damaging round for him, and the Croxley people were shouting their delight. "Gentlemen, I will not have this noise," Stapleton roared. "I have been accustomed to preside at a well-conducted club, and not at a bear garden." This little man, with the tilted hat and the bulging forehead, dominated the whole assembly. He was like a headmaster among his boys. He glared round him, and nobody cared to meet his eye. Anastasia had kissed the master when he resumed his seat. "Good lass, do it again!" cried the laughing crowd, and the angry master shook his glove at her, as she flapped her towel in front of him. Montgomery was weary and a little sore, but not depressed. He had learned something. He would not again be tempted into danger. For 3 rounds the honours were fairly equal. The student's hitting was the quicker, the master's the harder. Profiting by his lesson, Montgomery kept himself in the open and refused to be herded into a corner. Sometimes the master succeeded in rushing him to the side ropes, but the younger man slipped away, or closed and then disengaged. The monotonous "break away, break away" of the referee broke in upon the quick, low patter of rubber-soled shoes, the dull thud of the blows, and the sharp, hissing breath of 2 tired men. The 9th round found both of them in fairly good condition. Montgomery's head was still singing from the blow that he had in the corner, and one of his thumbs pained him acutely and seemed to be dislocated. The master showed no sign of a touch, but his breathing was the more laboured, and a long line of ticks upon the referee's paper showed that the student had a good show of points. But one of this Iron Man's blows was worth 3 of his, and he knew that without the gloves he could not have stood for 3 rounds against him. All the amateur work that he had done was the merest tapping and flapping when compared to those frightful blows, from arms toughened by the shovel and the crowbar. It was the 10th round, and the fight was half over. The betting now was only 3-1, for the Wilson champion had held his own much better than he had expected. But those who knew the ring-craft as well as the staying power of the old prize-fighter knew that the odds were still a long way in his favour. "Have a care of him," whispered Barton, as he sent his man up to the scratch. "Have a care. He'll play thee a trick if he can." But Montgomery saw, or imagined he saw, that his antagonist was tiring. He looked jaded and listless, and his hands drooped a little from their position. His own youth and condition were beginning to tell. He sprang in and brought off a fine left-handed lead. The master's return lacked his usual fire. Again Montgomery led, and again he got home. Then he tried his right upon the mark, and the master guarded it downwards. "Too low! Too low! A foul! A foul!" yelled 1,000 voices. The referee rolled his sardonic eyes slowly round. "Seems to me this building is chock full of referees," said he. The people laughed and applauded, but their favour was as immaterial to him as their anger. "No applause, please. This is not a theatre," he yelled. Montgomery was very pleased with himself. His adversary was evidently in a bad way. He was piling on his points and establishing a lead. He might as well make hay while the sun shone. The master was looking all abroad. Montgomery popped one upon his blue jowl and got away without a return, and then the master suddenly dropped both his hands and began rubbing his thigh. Ah, that was it, was it? He had a muscular cramp. "Go in! Go in!" cried Teddy Barton. Montgomery sprang wildly forward, and the next instant was lying half senseless, with his neck nearly broken, in the middle of the ring. The whole round had been a long conspiracy to tempt him within reach of one of those terrible right-hand uppercuts for which the master was famous. For this the listless, weary bearing, for this the cramp in the thigh. When Montgomery had sprung in so hotly, he had exposed himself to such a blow as neither flesh nor blood could stand. Whizzing up from below with a rigid arm which put the master's 11 stone into its force, it struck him under the jaw. He whirled half round and fell a helpless and half-paralyzed mass. A vague groan and murmur, inarticulate, too excited for words, rose from the great audience. With open mouths and staring eyes they gazed at the twitching and quivering figure. "Stand back! Stand right back!" shrieked the referee, for the master was standing over his man, ready to give him the coup de grace as he rose. "Stand back, Craggs, this instant!" Stapleton repeated. The master sank his hands sulkily and walked backwards to the rope with his ferocious eyes fixed upon his fallen antagonist. The timekeeper called the seconds. If 10 of them passed before Montgomery rose to his feet, the fight was ended. Ted Barton wrung his hands and danced about in agony in his corner. As if in a dream, a terrible nightmare, the student could hear the voice of the timekeeper. 3, 4, 5. He got up on his hand. 6, 7. He was on his knee, sick, swimming, faint, but resolute to rise. 8. He was up, and the master was on him like a tiger, lashing savagely at him with both hands. Folk held their breath as they watched those terrible blows and anticipated the pitiful end, so much more pitiful where a game but helpless man refuses to accept defeat. Strangely automatic is the human brain. Without volition, without effort, there shot into the memory of this bewildered, staggering, half-stupefied man the one thing which could have saved him, that blind eye of which the master's son had spoken. It was the same as the other to look at, but Montgomery remembered that he had said that it was the left. He reeled to the left side, half felled by a drive which lit upon his shoulder. The master pivoted round upon his leg and was at him in an instant. "Yark him, lad! Yark him!" screamed the woman. "Hold your tongue!" said the referee. Montgomery slipped to the left again and yet again, but the master was too quick and clever for him. He struck round and got him full on the face as he tried once more to break away. Montgomery's knees weakened under him, and he fell with a groan on the floor. This time he knew that he was done. With bitter agony he realized, as he groped blindly with his hands, that he could not possibly raise himself. Far away and muffled he heard, amid the murmurs of the multitude, the fateful voice of the timekeeper counting off the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. "Time!" said the referee. Then the pent-up passion of the great assembly broke loose. Croxley gave a deep groan of disappointment. The Wilsons were on their feet, yelling with delight. There was still a chance for them. In 4 more seconds their man would have been solemnly counted out, but now he had a minute in which to recover. The referee looked round with relaxed features and laughing eyes. He loved this rough game, this school for humble heroes, and it was pleasant to him to intervene as a deus ex machina at so dramatic a moment. His chair and his hat were both tilted at an extreme angle. He and the timekeeper smiled at each other. Ted Barton and the other second had rushed out and thrust an arm each under Montgomery's knee, the other behind his loins, and so carried him back to his stool. His head lolled upon his shoulder, but a douche of cold water sent a shiver through him, and he started and looked round him. "He's all right!" cried the people round. "He's a rare brave lad! Good lad! Good lad!" Barton poured some brandy into his mouth. The mists cleared a little, and he realized where he was and what he had to do. But he was still very weak, and he hardly dared to hope that he could survive another round. "Seconds out of the ring!" cried the referee. "Time!" The Croxley master sprang eagerly off his stool. "Keep clear of him! Go easy for a bit!" said Barton, and Montgomery walked out to meet his man once more. He had had 2 lessons, the one when the master got him into his corner, the other when he had been lured into mixing it up with so powerful an antagonist. Now he would be wary. Another blow would finish him. He could afford to run no risks. The master was determined to follow up his advantage, and rushed at him, slogging furiously right and left. But Montgomery was too young and active to be caught. He was strong upon his legs once more, and his wits had all come back to him. It was a gallant sight, the line of battleship, trying to pour its overwhelming broadside into the frigate, and the frigate manoeuvring always so as to avoid it. The master tried all his ringcraft. He coaxed the student up by pretended inactivity. He rushed at him with furious rushes towards the ropes. For 3 rounds he exhausted every wile in trying to get at him. Montgomery during all this time was conscious that his strength was minute by minute coming back to him. The spinal jar from an uppercut is overwhelming, but evanescent. He was losing all sense of it beyond a great stiffness of the neck. For the first round after his downfall he had been content to be entirely on the defensive, only too happy if he could stall off the furious attacks of the master. In the second he occasionally ventured upon a light encounter. In the third he was smacking back merrily where he saw an opening. His people yelled their approval of him at the end of every round. Even the ironworkers cheered him with that fine unselfishness which true sport engenders. To most of them, unspiritual and unimaginative, the sight of this clean-limbed young Apollo, rising above disaster and holding on while consciousness was in him to his appointed task, was the greatest thing their experience had ever known. But the Master's naturally morose temper became more and more murderous at this postponement of his hopes. 3 rounds ago the battle had been in his hands. Now it was all to do over again. Round by round his man was recovering his strength. By the 15th he was strong again in wind and limb. But the vigilant Anastasia saw something which encouraged her. "That bash into ribs is telling on him, Jock," she whispered. "Why else should he be gulping to brandy? Go in, lad, and thou hast him yet." Montgomery had suddenly taken the flask from Barton's hand and had a deep pull at the contents. Then, with his face a little flushed and with a curious look of purpose, which made the referee stare hard at him, in his eyes, he rose for the 16th round. "Game as a partridge," cried the publican, as he looked at the hard-set face. "Mix it oop, lad, mix it oop," cried the iron men to their master, and then a hum of exultation ran through their ranks as they realised that their tougher, harder, stronger man held the vantage after all. Neither of the men showed much sign of punishment. Small gloves crush and numb, but they do not cut. One of the master's eyes was even more flush with his cheek than nature had made it. Montgomery had 2 or 3 livid marks upon his body, and his face was haggard, save for that pink spot which the brandy had brought into either cheek. He rocked a little as he stood opposite his man, and his hands drooped as if he felt the gloves to be an unutterable weight. It was evident that he was spent and desperately weary. If he received one other blow, it must surely be fatal to him. If he brought one home, what power could there be behind it, and what chance was there of its harming the colossus in front of him? It was the crisis of the fight. This round must decide it. "Mix it oop, lad, mix it oop," the iron men whooped. Even the savage eyes of the referee were unable to restrain the excited crowd. Now, at last, the chance had come for Montgomery. He had learned a lesson from his more experienced rival. Why should he not play his own game upon him? He was spent, but not nearly so spent as he pretended. That brandy was to call up his reserves, to let him have strength to take full advantage of the opening when it came. It was thrilling and tingling through his veins at the very moment when he was lurching and rocking like a beaten man. He acted his part admirably. The Master felt that there was an easy task before him, and rushed in with ungainly activity to finish it once for all. He slap-banged away, left and right, boring Montgomery up against the ropes, swinging in his ferocious blows with those animal grunts which told of the vicious energy behind them. But Montgomery was too cool to fall a victim to any of those murderous uppercuts. He kept out of harm's way with a rigid guard, an active foot, and a head which was swift to duck. And yet he contrived to present the same appearance of a man who is hopelessly done. The Master, weary from his own shower of blows, and fearing nothing from so weak a man, dropped his hand for an instant, and at that instant Montgomery's right came home. It was a magnificent blow, straight, clean, crisp, with the force of the loins and the back behind it. And it landed where he had meant it to, upon the exact point of that blue-grained chin. Flesh and blood could not stand such a blow in such a place. Neither valour nor hardihood could save the man to whom it comes. The Master fell backwards, flat, prostrate, striking the ground with so simultaneous a clap that it was like a shutter falling from a wall. A yell, which no referee could control, broke from the crowded benches as the giant went down. He lay upon his back, his knees a little drawn up, his huge chest panting. He twitched and shook, but could not move. His feet pawed convulsively once or twice. It was no use. He was done. 8, 9, 10, said the timekeeper, and the roar of 1,000 voices, with a deafening clap like the broadside of a ship, told that the Master of Croxley was the master no more. Montgomery stood half-dazed, looking down at the huge, prostrate figure. He could hardly realize that it was indeed all over. He saw the referee motion towards him with his hand. He heard his name bellowed in triumph from every side, and then he was aware of someone rushing towards him. He caught a glimpse of a flushed face and an aureole of flying red hair. A gloveless fist struck him between the eyes, and he was on his back in the ring beside his antagonist, while a dozen of his supporters were endeavouring to secure the frantic Anastasia. He heard the angry shouting of the referee, the screaming of the ferocious woman, and the cries of the mob. Then something seemed to break like an overstretched banjo string, and he sank into the deep, deep, mist-girt abyss of unconsciousness. The dressing was like a thing in a dream, and so was a vision of the master with the grin of a bulldog upon his face and his 3 teeth amiably protruded. He shook Montgomery heartily by the hand. "I would have been rare pleased to shake thee by the throttle, lad, a short while syne," said he. "But I bear no ill feelin' again thee. It was a rare poonch that brought me down. I have not had a better since my second fight with Billy Edwards in '89. Happen thou might think o' goin' further with this business. If thou dost, and want a trainer, there's not much inside the ropes as I don't know. Or happen thou might like to try it with me old style and bare knuckles. Thou hast but to write to t' ironworks to find me." But Montgomery disclaimed any such ambition. A canvas bag with his share, 190 sovereigns, was handed to him, of which he gave 10 to the master, who also received some share of the gate money. Then, with young Wilson escorting him on one side, Purvis on the other, and Fawcett carrying his bag behind, he went in triumph to his carriage and drove amid a long roar, which lined the highway like a hedge for the 7 miles, back to his starting point. "It's the greatest thing I ever saw in my life. By George, it's ripping!" cried Wilson, who had been left in a kind of ecstasy by the events of the day. "There's a chap over Barnsley way who fancies himself a bit. Let us spring you upon him, and let him see what he can make of you. We'll put up a purse, won't we, Purvis? You shall never want a backer." "At his weight," said the publican, "I'm behind him. I am, for 20 rounds, and no age, country, or colour barred." "So am I," cried Fawcett. "Middleweight champion of the world, that's what he is. Here, in the same carriage with us." But Montgomery was not to be beguiled. "No, I have my own work to do now." "And what might that be?" "I'll use this money to get my medical degree." "Well, we've plenty of doctors, but you're the only man in the writing that can smack the Croxley Master off his legs. However, I suppose you know your own business best. When you're a doctor, you'd best come down into these parts, and you'll always find a job waiting for you at the Wilson coal pits." Montgomery had returned by devious ways to the surgery. The horses were smoking at the door, and the doctor was just back from his long journey. Several patients had called in his absence, and he was in the worst of tempers. "I suppose I should be glad that you have come back at all, Mr. Montgomery," he snarled. "When next you elect to take a holiday, I trust it will not be at so busy a time." "I am sorry, sir, that you should have been inconvenienced." "Yes, sir, I have been exceedingly inconvenienced." Here, for the first time, he looked hard at the assistant. "Good heavens, Mr. Montgomery, what have you been doing with your left eye?" It was where Anastasia had lodged her protest. Montgomery laughed. "It is nothing, sir," said he. "And you have a livid mark under your jaw. It is indeed terrible that my representative should be going about in so disreputable a condition. How did you receive these injuries?" "Well, sir, as you know, there was a little glove fight to-day over at Croxley." "And you got mixed up with that brutal crowd?" "I was rather mixed up with them." "And who assaulted you?" "One of the fighters." "Which of them?" "The Master of Croxley." "Good heavens! Perhaps you interfered with him?" "Well, to tell the truth, I did a little." "Mr. Montgomery, in such a practice as mine, intimately associated as it is with the highest and most progressive elements of our small community, it is impossible—" But just then the tentative bray of a cornet player searching for his keynote jarred upon their ears, and an instant later the Wilson Colliery Brass Band was in full cry with "See the Conquering Hero Comes" outside the surgery window. There was a banner waving and a shouting crowd of miners. "What is it? What does it mean?" cried the angry doctor. "It means, sir, that I have, in the only way which was open to me, earned the money which is necessary for my education. It is my duty, Dr. Oldacre, to warn you that I am about to return to the university, and that you should lose no time in appointing my successor." End of Chapter 3. In the Croxley Master.
Section 9 of The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Crean, Lilburn, Georgia. The Green Flag and Other Stories of War and Sport by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The Lord of Chateau Noir. It was in the days when the German armies had broken their way across France, and when the shattered forces of the young Republic had been swept away to the north of the Aisne and to the south of the Loire. Three broad streams of armed men had rolled